$500 flat increase to their pay, whereas the Senate is only providing the 1% increase and not providing the flat rate higher of. Interestingly, the Senate proposes a 2.5% increase for other state employees, so they are providing a different increase for local school district employees. The retirement and health costs continue to rise, which will place an increased budget strain on the local school districts, especially those in low-wealth counties, as they have to provide that also for their locally funded employees, teachers and non-certified, and including their school nutrition employees. So moving to the allotment categories, the school safety grants. The Senate and House have comparable funding for the school mental health professionals, and both expand the definition of allowable expenditures to include mental health professionals that are not licensed through DPI. In other words, they may not be a licensed school social worker, but they are licensed but they are a licensed social worker. So it does expand the employees that are allowed to be paid out of those grants, and it also includes contracted personnel. The Senate did not include the match requirement that the House had proposed for these grants. The House had a match requirement of $1 local dollar for every 2 grant dollars for the school mental health professional grant. In addition, the House required that 25% of that grant be used for school psychologists. The Senate proposed a new allotment category restricted for the use of school psychologists, and it would fund, the intent is 100 school psychologists for each county. But the funding is created by reducing the instructional support position allotment, the general position allotment that funds media coordinators, the social workers, school nurses, and school psychologists by $27 million, and then appropriating another additional $8 million to fund that school psychologist position allotment. Where the House is proposing the increases to the other school safety grants, and that includes the school resource officer, the safety equipment, training, and students in crisis grants. The House had most of the money in the second year of the biennium. The Senate is putting those funds in the first year, so they would be effective in 2019-20. The textbook and digital resource allotment, both House and Senate keep pretty much the appropriation flat, consistent, the same level, total appropriation as this current year. So it would be it would be at the $74 million range. For instructional supplies, there was a Senate separate bill that proposed the North Carolina Supplies Program and funding to put purchasing power into the hands of the teachers in being able to purchase instructional supplies. Both the House and the Senate appropriated $15 million for a variation of this program. The House required us to set up a separate allocation, and the program had more involvement with DPI in the administration of that program. The Senate uses similar language. Well, it's really the same language that was in the Senate bill, and it includes the funds into the existing allotment category of instructional supplies. So it's adding funding to the allotment category of instructional supplies. The $15 million would be sufficient to fund the $145 per teacher that is proposed in the House. However, if the Senate requirement of $300 per teacher was actually to become final, there would be a need for LEAs to use their existing instructional supplies allotment to meet that requirement. For transportation, both the budgets fund the adjustment for fuel. However, the Senate also includes a $3 million EC transportation grant to cover extraordinary transportation costs for high-needs children with disabilities attending LEAs and charter schools. The Cooperative Innovative High School funding allotment. Currently, schools that are approved and funded through the General Assembly, or the State Board and the General Assembly, they receive a supplemental allotment of $275,000, $200,000, or $180,000 per school, depending on what tier that county is in. So the low wealth counties receive the higher amount. The Senate budget has a significant difference than the House in the fact that it recommends phasing out that supplemental funding over the next 3 years. And so that comes to, this current year allotment came to about $24.5 million, not including tuition for universities. So that would be a 3-year phase out, depending on when the school was initially funded. Other items in the Senate, but not in the House, the Senate includes a $3 million amount for the school nutrition copay. And they also include $1.1 million in cuts to DPI positions that have been vacant for a year. Some of those positions have been actively recruited for. Some of them were in progress, but there is a $1.1 million reduction from those positions. There is also $250,000 for 2 financial personnel. In the House budget, but not in the Senate, is $550,000 for cybersecurity, $200,000 for data analytics area at DPI, $700,000 for the digital learning, and then $1.25 million in the computer science plan. With that, those are all the money items. I know that Cecilia is going to address some of the independent bills and maybe some of the other items. I'm happy to take any questions this far.
Thank you, Ms. Schaus. Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you very much, Alexis. I have a question about I think it was a new allotment for school psychologist. Would it be up to the local, was that $27 million? Is that? Or?
Actually, the total amount is $35 million.
Okay, $35 million. So would it be up to the LEA to decide, because it sounds like there's a trade-off, you get a school psychologist allotment in lieu of a media coordinator or a school nurse or one other category?
Well, they wouldn't really have the decision. Their allotment will be reduced regardless of how they're funding their school psychologists. Their allotment will be reduced. Everyone will be reduced in the same share. And then that funding from that reduction will be moved over to the school psychologist. So if you have a school psychologist, or your school psychologists, for instance, are funded out of the Exceptional Children's Grant, which many of them are, and you don't have any school psychologists funded out of the instructional support position, then there would be a disconnect, and a choice would need to be made.
And there's an amount in here for the 4 school systems with I've lost it. The advanced teaching roles. I think it's what, 5, is that $5 million?
500,000.
Mm-hmm. So is that to pay salaries for any kind of changes in their responsibilities and roles?
It is. I'm actually going to leave that because Cecilia is going to address that specific grant. Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Good information.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. So the board had about 30 items on our budget, and we ended up with about half of those in either the House or Senate or both. In terms of the larger ticket items that were high profile for the state board, The school support positions, we had 72 million in our budget in additional funding. The school psychologist allotment did add 8 million, and then the House and the Senate had additional support positions, but they would be funded through grants. On behalf of the board, we've weighed in that it would be more advantageous for the districts to be able to receive FTEs versus grants for those positions. When we laid out the chart, in order to meet the national recommended ratios, it would require another 688 million to get us to the national recommended ratios. And in order to be able to have consistency in our fund source and to be able to recruit for those difficult positions to fill, it's much more advantageous for the districts to have some sort of consistency in the funding. So we have requested and suggested that they put those in to FTEs or into the allotment in that way. In regards to the school psychologist, the intent of the Senate, I believe, was to make sure that every district has at least one school psychologist. And there are a handful of districts currently that have not been able to hire a school psychologist. My understanding is that those are difficult positions to fill, especially in some of the rural areas of the state. So the recommendation that we have provided back is, rather than create a separate allotment, instead add the additional 8 million into the school support allotment, and then require through a special provision that the money be used to hire a school psychologist. And for those districts that still are unable to do so, that they would be allowed to hire either through contract services, or if they're still simply unable to do so, then they would submit an affidavit stating that they have not been able to fill it. But that way, we're not locking up all of those additional funds just for school psychologists in lieu of the other support positions. Another item that was high profile on the state board's list of budget requests was the additional regional support positions. And that was not in either the House nor the Senate budget. So that was one of the items that was not in either of those. In terms of the bills, we had at the start of the session and over the course of the session, we ended up with about 350 K-12 bills that got filed, and about 25% of those actually ended up making it over to crossover. And of the 80-plus bills that made it crossover, about 25% of those are getting some traction or actually ended up in a special provision in the budget. What I'm going to attempt to do is to focus in on the handful that seem to be getting traction that I think are of high profile and interest to the state board. So one of those is going to be speaking to the advanced teaching roles, which did end up in both of the budgets. Neither of those bills made crossover, but they ended up in the budgets. The difference in the language, there's money in there in the House and the Senate versions, but the difference in the language is that the Senate version removes the flexibility for class size and removes the flexibility for budgets. And those are critical for the implementation of the program. So I know that there's a significant push to try to get those back into whatever the final budget version looks like. One of the bills that did make crossover that we've also weighed in on is House Bill 107, which is the PED study for the educator preparation program. We provided a significant amount of input, and the final edition that ended up making crossover does reflect the state board, DPI, and higher education institution input. In addition to that, we're pushing for something that was raised at the last Pepsi Commission meeting, and this is something that's in the Senate Bill 599 language. The current language states that an EPP would be given a warning status if they fail to meet any performance standard indicator. And it has been determined that there are some institutions that would be placed on a warning status based on one of those indicators, but it may not be their particular fault. So the proposed language would have a weighted average, and that they would have the warning status based on an overall composite threshold score that's based off of a weighted performance standard. Another bill that made crossover that the state board actually sponsored or worked with members to sponsor, and this is a bill that would have the Professional Educator Preparation Standards Commission have staggered terms so that everybody would not roll off of that commission at the same time. And then the other piece in that language is allowing for designees for the Education Workforce Innovation Commission, which gives out grants for CTE. Right now, it does not allow for designees, so this would just allow for that. The final piece to that language is some requested date changes for reports that would be helpful for getting the input over to the General Assembly and those reports and meeting deadlines. An item that was in the House budget that was a special provision was also in a bill that made crossover. We talked about it a little bit last month. It's the House Bill 315, instructional material selection. That bill would eliminate the state involvement in the textbook selection process, and it would also eliminate the textbook purchasing at the state level. What it does offer for, that was something that the board had on our list, was it would allow for the purchase of devices with the use of that money, and that was taken away in the last budget. So it gives us the flexibility there, but it does take away the state level involvement on the textbook process. So we have requested that we not lose the state level involvement. That in particular would be detrimental to some of the smaller districts that may not have the resources to fulfill that at the local level. A bill that made crossover, House Bill 697, is regarding state surplus property for computers for nonprofits. This allows donation or at a very low fee, state property and computers to be donated or sold at a low cost to nonprofits. I bring that to your attention because the state board has been very supportive of the homework gap work, and we continue those efforts, and we have several districts that came on board last session or last school year. We've got several others that have already signed up to do it this school year. So this bill would help with getting computers in the hands of students who may not have them at home. The state board has been heavily involved in the language that would pertain to the ISD and the low performing schools. House Bill 798 made it to crossover, and we've been working with the sponsor of that bill based on the work of the subcommittee that was led by JB and Amy, and trying to get that language PCS'd over on the Senate side. So we've done quite a bit of work there that would be helpful in modifying the existing language around those low-performing schools and the ISD. Senate Bill 219, modify teacher licensing requirements. That bill made crossover. House Bill 521 was another bill that spoke to teacher licensure. The state board has adopted policy that would speak to out-of-state licenses. It's been determined that there are specific provisions that the state board is not able to address through policy that need to be modified in the law. So we're working with them on Senate Bill 219 to add any additional provisions that need to be clarified. The Senate Bill 219 was PCS'd, and it actually has a blend between House Bill 521 and 219. It creates 2 additional teacher licenses. So the state board, we are weighing in that if there's ways to do it without creating additional licenses, but instead to put in particular provisions that might address any concerns, that would be our preference. One of the things the bill does address is the ability for the locals to pay teachers based on what they believe they will ultimately be licensed at for these out-of-state teachers, so they can use state funds to pay the teachers and not be held, they can be held harmless during that process. So that would just help them to not have to be paid on a substitute salary while they're pending licensure. The other thing that the bill does do that we certainly have weighed in on and requested was it allows 3 years to pass the test, so that aligns with a 3-year license, which would make it easier for tracking. Senate Bill 354 is a charter school closure bill. This bill would require a CSAB member and a state board member to attend a public hearing for continually low-performing charters and also prior to charter termination. The thing that we like in the bill is it eliminates the requirement for the Office of Administrative Hearing process that's currently required for charter school closures. We have requested that if the state board member and a CSAB member is going to be required to attend a public hearing, that it be required after CSAB has voted to not renew a charter or to terminate a charter. And my understanding is that if we do it after CSAB has voted to make that recommendation to the state board, but prior to the state board voting on it, it would allow the public to have an opportunity to present their perspective in front of a state board member and a CSAB member prior to the state board voting, but would not be, it wouldn't require it on the front end. And the reason that it would be beneficial to make that modification is whenever CSAB votes not to renew a charter, sometimes those charters actually will turn in their charter prior to having to have the state board vote on it. So it would be fewer public hearings that the state board and the charter school advisory member would be required to attend. So considering that both are volunteer boards, that would be helpful, not to have to attend any meetings otherwise. Senate Bill 366 is a 9th and 10th grade college transfer pathway. The part of the bill there that the state board has weighed in on is this is trying to allow 9th and 10th graders to also participate and attend and take advantage of college courses. The Cooperative Innovatives do that today, but they have all of the support resources in place for 9th and 10th graders. The concern would be that you would have 9th and 10th graders taking advantage of college courses on the same campus with the college students without the support resources around it. So we have provided input to try to help minimize any risk for this particular student population in that age bracket. And then finally, I'll speak to House Bill 434. This is a House bill that made crossover. The Senate version, which is mental health bill, the Senate version did not make crossover. We've partnered with the House sponsor, and they are supportive of us trying to get the language from the Senate version into the House version. This mental health bill is reflective of the superintendent's working group recommendations. It is also in alignment with a lot of the policy that was originally put forward for the state board on the mental health policy. And so we're hoping to see some traction with the PCS of the current House bill. But this has been supported by all of the different advocacy groups. With that, what I'll do is just speak to a couple of bills that did not make crossover, but that we are still trying to get some traction on. One, it touches on the principal bonus, the double bonus. We have about 90 principals who were not paid based on the way that the language was written on the front end last session. So what we're requesting is that the 90 principals who were eligible based on the fact that they were a D or an F school and that they were in the top 50% of growth, some principals actually moved beyond a D or an F school and became an A, B, or C school, and the technical language did not allow them to qualify. So we're continuing to stay on that to try to get those principals paid. And then the last one is we requested and helped to sponsor a bill that would restore the state sales tax refund for the schools. That did not make crossover. It is not in either of the budgets. So I just bring that to your attention so that the board will likely want to continue to try to work on that. With that, I will open it up to any questions or comments.
Questions from Ms. Holden? Mr. Buxton?
Got a list of 4, I think, if I could just tick through those. On the advanced teaching roles, there's some language in the Senate provision, I think, about tying salary to student achievement and professional growth. Is that a requirement for us to develop that? And is it a requirement for the districts to do that, or is it a model that we're providing to them?
Freebird, do you have any input? We worked on a lot of the language that ended up in the 2 bills that came out. And while the bills were exact and companion bills, the language that ended up in the Senate was a different flavor. Do you have any input on the recollection for the specifics behind?
We can talk I'll go back through and look at my notes on that.
Okay.
Come back and talk to you about that.
Okay.
And we can do it at the session.
Second one is on cooperative innovative high schools, and Mr. Chairman, I'd direct this maybe to you. In some planning with the SLA committee, we had talked about a series of discussions for the board about cooperative innovative high schools, kind of 15 years in, and staff has some ideas about things that could help as we move forward, including budget related. And so I think, a little unfortunate that we're behind that process, it appears now, because I think there's some budget-related things that I'm concerned about that are coming out of the Senate around cooperative innovative high schools that we had intended to take a look at and put a proposal together on, including Dr. Mason's suggestion around an early college district-wide model. So it may be that as we get into conference, and maybe with the support of the governor as well, we could forestall a little bit of that work, given that we're going to try to come forward from this board with some suggestions. So I just put that on the table. Third one, does Senate Bill 219 still contain the affidavit, the local affidavit?
It does. It removes the tiers. It still has the affidavit in there. So yes,
Okay, so I would just,
it does not have a renewable license. It only is the.
I would just put into public record with us that I think if you give an affidavit to 115 school districts, then we have 115 sets of standards for teachers in our state. The last question is on regional support, and obviously that was a huge budget request of this board at almost $5 million. We're thankful that the governor added to that. We have very little support for low-performing schools in districts throughout the state. So my question is, given the vacancy report yesterday, what some of our options might look like if we do not have legislative support. Obviously, we would need to think about not doing the exact same thing we asked for, because I think there are some rules around that. But whether we have some opportunity as a board to work with the superintendent and staff to think about what the vacancies allow us to do to put services out in the field to support low-performing schools and districts. So I would just, that's an unfortunate mission in both the House and Senate budgets, which is service to the field. And I think that's one we probably should continue to focus on, what we can do internally.
Thank you. If I can touch on the cooperative innovatives real quickly.
Please.
On behalf of the board, I have weighed in. The House version did not include the additional 1.5 million we had requested, but the Senate does. So we're thankful that it's in there, that would fund those 7 that did not get funding already. It does eliminate, after a 3-year window, it begins to phase out that funding. And so the input that I've received is that that additional funding is used because there's an extensive amount of money that is needed for the cooperative innovatives for textbooks, and it's also needed for counselors to try to help them through the college process and those sorts of things. The RTI has done an extensive amount of research around this topic and believes that there's a significant return on the investment for the state. So I have information that I'm sharing that would clearly demonstrate the student population that typically attends a cooperative innovative. It is the student population that we are trying to speak to in things such as My Future NC and post-secondary attainment and the credentialing and all that we're trying to do to try to meet the future workforce needs of tomorrow. For those schools, if we begin to start seeing any of those not be able to stay in existence, I think that that's going to be a negative for the state down the road, because I think they've been extremely supportive of where we're trying to go as a state and filling the workforce needs.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes, I want to continue a little bit of a discussion around the advanced teaching roles and say to the board that whatever we need to do to make sure, and I want to make sure I'm getting this right. I don't know which chamber is considering the possibility of removing budget flexibility and class size. Okay, so if those two beacons of hope in that goes away, I'm going to tell you, so goes the grant.
Yeah.
Because maybe I'm wrong in my wish for this advanced teaching role initiative, but I can see us learning a lot about how to create a really effective career ladder in North Carolina in terms of a pay scale. So we've got to do whatever we need to do, because I don't know the other pieces in that grant, the other requirements that schools are being innovative around, but removing your ability to make decisions about money and class size is huge. So whatever we need to do,
There's a lot of focus around trying to get that back in. So,
yay.
and it's not just from the state board's perspective. I think that there's a lot of advocacy groups working on that.
Marvelous. I
Mr.
rest-
Ford?
So thank you so much for this update, and I apologize if you've already spoken to these things, but has there been much discussion about the proposed professional development for teachers and school leaders. I noticed that it was in our proposed budget, and the governor's, and it's zero in either the House or the Senate. But I do see $10 million from both the House and the Senate for textbooks and digital materials, and I think optically that just looks a little odd. Has there been any discussion about preparing teachers and leaders to be able to offer exemplary educational opportunity? Because I think that sans doing that, right? It doesn't matter how many digital materials we have or tools. I think it'll be very hard lift to make sure we increase the level of education. So I'm just curious if there's any discussion around that.
I'll address it in two different ways. So NCAT did receive money in
I did
both
notice
budgets.
that, yes.
So I would consider that to be part of the professional development
Sure.
request of the board. I think that the Senate's expectation, although it's not stated in the special provision, is that that go towards the early learning and literacy professional development for teachers. In regards to the House version, they have the $2.4 million for the digital learning and the digital learning money. A lot of that has also been used for professional development for the teachers. It is not in the Senate version. So certainly we would be working to try to get that. That was in the state board budget to try to restore that $2.4 million. So they're calling it different things in different ways and different focuses on how that money would be spent. To your point on the $10 million going in for the textbooks, that money is, we had non-recurring funds in the textbook allotment last year, so this would replenish those. On the Senate side, it makes them recurring, which is great.
Thank you.
Ms. Godwin?
James Ford stole my thunder. Okay? But hey, James. Hey, look at me. Hey. That was what I was going to talk about as well. I was very hurt to see that there was no money allotted in the budget for professional development, and yet we continue to put pressure on our schools, our teachers, our districts to perform. That yet we're not giving our teachers the tools, the strategies, what they need to be the best that they can be, and to provide the services that need to be given to these children. So I still want you to continue to fight for that, y'all, because I'm going to fight for it, even though I'm not at the table. Thank you for that.
Will do. Mr. McKinney?
And I'll echo that sentiment, and I think Dr. Trice said it as well, is that as he's traveled around the state, he sees that teachers are hungry for more opportunities like that. I also wanted to ask if there's, if you might be able to highlight the reason why there seems to be some consistency in the school nutrition reduced price meals to copay from both state board, governor, and the Senate, but not from the House, and if there was any reason you might be able to kind of shed light on that, and if there's hope that there'll be a compromise maybe at the end on that.
I have hope. I know that the senator who was sponsoring that is certainly a senator who has a voice over there. I think that there was interest from the House side. I think it was probably
The bill, yeah.
limited funding that ended up that didn't make it through, but I'm hopeful.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Duncan?
Couple of business operations areas. I wanted to clarify one thing on the for our non-certified employees. The increase was either, I think if I heard it correctly, it was either 1% or $500. Is that recurring? That is, that it would go to their pension?
I'll ask Alexis to weigh in on the details.
She's nodding yes.
Oh, she's
So
nodding.
that's at
It
least.
is 1%.
Sometimes
and it is
bonuses
recurring.
don't, so I wanted to make sure that all that went there. But I do want to draw this distinction. I don't want to lose sight of this, and I think it's important that the board not lose sight of this. Last year, the state passed a living wage for people who would be state employees and well warranted and well done. So, for example, and I'm going to use one category of our non-certified employees, custodians in state buildings around the state who do such a wonderful job are paid a living wage at $15 an hour. It's approximately $30,000 a year if you play it out over the year. And if I understand it correctly, they would be in line for a 2.5% increase in wage along with all other state workers, which then would be a larger increase than say, school custodians. School custodians do an equally wonderful job. They have the duty of making our buildings look good. Many of them 100 or more years old in several instances. And they do so not just with adults in the building, but with 1.5 million students in our buildings. And their wages are not close to the $15 an hour or living wage, and their increase, it would be substantially less than those who are there. So I applaud the General Assembly for what they did, and I would hope that we can find a way to encourage that to apply to employees who provide the same functions and do a wonderful job of it around the state, and as well as in all our other non-certified positions. And I add to that one other thing. We talk often about the issues of equity and poverty in terms of how it so drastically and dramatically can affect the lives of many of our students and interfere with their educational process because of their circumstances in many instances. Many of those children are the children of our own non-certified employees, many of them. And so we're not ultimately doing our part to change the dynamic for those families in the way that we want to if we don't advocate for this in a way that I think is meaningful for them. And so I do hope, I understand we are not in a place where that's likely for anything to happen, but I do not want us to lose sight of that. I do want to raise that up, and I do think it's important that we not lose sight of it. It affects not just our employees, but the families of our employees and our students, and it makes a meaningful difference. The other area that I wanted to lift up, I thank you for the report that we were unsuccessful with respect to the school construction issue, that is the sales tax issue. I'm disappointed by the report, but I appreciate your letting us know. It will be helpful at some point if we could have a dialogue to get an understanding about this, because our state treasurer, who serves on this board, State Treasurer Falwell, has advocated very strongly for the fact that that refund should be in place, and has pointed out the inconsistency that every other nonprofit, every other governmental entity does in fact get that refund. We are the only, that is public schools, are the only entities that do not get that refund, and that's a puzzling, hard to understand exception. State legislature very thoughtfully just recently acted quickly and importantly for all the residents of the state to help our friends and neighbors in the eastern part of the state and the schools there by pulling out a significant amount of funds on an emergency basis to assist with the devastating damage that's been done to so many of our school facilities in the eastern part of the state. Necessarily, they're getting ready to do a reconstruction or renovation. They're getting ready to spend very substantial construction costs of state funds that were just given by the legislature. We could certainly do them a favor by allowing them to keep the sales tax amounts that are going to be associated with construction, and that's a significant amount of money. That could expand what they could successfully do to assist our educators and students to have places of learning that are adequate and are very much needed right now because of the damage that was done. It could also help other communities that have suffered from wind damage or tornado damage or other flooding circumstances around the state who are also having to endeavor to engage in such activities. And so I feel obligated just to lift up that we need, if no one else will, to try to keep that flame alive and try to reach some understanding through good and fruitful discussions with our legislators, who I know have a good heart, or they would not have gone and so quickly move forward the funds to the counties that needed it. That let's maximize the use of those funds to help those counties and other counties to the very best way we can. And so I do hope we will continue to lift that up regardless of where we sit right this second. It's a second of reflection that leads to, I think, ongoing action. I'd always learned that someone had always told me that the Duncan family motto, which I didn't tell my wife till after we were married, was learn to suffer. But I have recently discovered there's an alternative interpretation, which I like much better, which is learn to be persistent. And so I hope we will learn to be persistent on this issue. Thank you for giving me that moment to get clarification from you and express those sentiments.
Thank you. I'll add, we were successful in getting a couple of bills filed to reflect that language that we were hoping for. with bipartisan support. The message that I've continued to send and will continue, and I'm very persistent as well, is that especially as we look at any school bond or any other sort of school construction money, if ever there was a time, now is the time, because we want to keep that money in those districts wherever the money's allocated, so.
Dr. Wallace.
Thank you, Chairman. Got two prongs. I have a comment and I have a question. Okay. I want to piggyback off of what Vice Chair Duncan just said about the importance of custodials and what their pay is and this and that. That falls under the umbrella of classified personnel. That classified personnel encompasses bus drivers. We can have bus drivers and we don't take care of them. We can't have school because the kids won't be there. If we don't take care of the custodians, then the kids won't come because the place will be dirty and they're not going to sit in class and they're uncomfortable. Front office personnel, I just lost both of mine this year due to pay concerns because they can't make ends meet. And even put them on a bus, let them drive a bus and get $1,000 supplement. That's pretty much what you get if you drive a bus for a month. That still wasn't enough to get her to be able to make ends meet. And I just bring that out now because without these people, we can't have school. We have the best teachers in the world, but the kids are not there. Cannot have school. So right now, I'm looking at they said on 1/1/2020, it's a $500 bonus for these classified personnel, and we seem to forget them in this budgetary discussion that we always have. And it's been years since we've actually addressed that concern. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I wanted to use this mic to make sure that somebody hope somebody in this state hears me, that these cries have gone unanswered for so long, and nobody has really got it. You can't have school without your classified personnel, because that's the front office that keeps you safe. They buzzing people in and out. They're the ones that answer the phone when the parents call, they need their child. They're the ones that's calling home to mama when the child is sick. And also, these are the bus drivers that we call out in times of bad weather. They're out there first before we close school. They've already ventured the roads, and they're on the bus by the time we call school. And now they got to go back through the ice to get back home. So I just wanted to throw that out. I hope somebody hears me, because we have not, those voices have not been heard in years. Classified personnel. And then I'm hearing discussions about the early college funding maybe getting reduced or cut the next 2 or 3 years. I didn't see this in the readings and the summary, but I would just hope that we would look at that again, because those are the true hubs of innovation. As a high school principal, we look at what they do with the curriculum, STEM, robotics, aeronautics, how they feed right to, they continue the STEM pipeline, they feed right on to the four-year universities, and they're that bridge that we need to innovation. And we use them sometimes as a small pipe. Instead of doing big budget deployments where we spend $35 million on a grand initiative and then we find out 5 years it doesn't work, we do it at the early college. And the early college does it in small class sizes to make sure. It's like the book says, shoot BBs before you shoot cannonball. And then we take that and then we then deploy it in schools. Therefore, we have not wasted taxpayer dollars, and we have not wasted the time of the parents, the stakeholders, and the shareholders, and most importantly, the Board of Education and our legislature. So, I mean, I just would caution before you go cutting the early college, because that system works. We have 2 of them in Craven County. We partially funded one of them, the one in Havelock that feeds to the military base. So I just wanted to hope somebody hears me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Dr. Oxenbould?
I'm curious about a category of funding I see in this Excel spreadsheet. It catches my attention, and there are dollar amounts in it, but for instance, real school gardens. So it says education support organizations. So what does that mean? I mean, how does that get in the budget? I know that
Ever
must
seen
be
how the
a
sausage is
ridiculous
made?
question.
Thank you, JB.
I'm sorry for asking the question, but I can't resist.
These were some projects, I think, that maybe.
Special projects
Yeah.
that address education issues, probably.
Right.
I got it. Just asking.
Any other comments?
Ms.
Mr. Chastain?
Ms. Holden, you mentioned the sales tax with Alan was just talking about. You know the total budget amount for that? What that would be if you got a refund of sales tax like they do for other organizations?
The amount, the way that the current maneuvering of funds works is the districts are paying in the state sales tax. that otherwise would be refunded based on our request. So when they move the money in, it goes over to Department of Revenue. Department of Revenue then transfers money over to the public school fund. The public school fund then transfers money out. So the net to the state in terms of how much it would cost once all of those transactions are done, based on historical numbers, is around 25 million that it would cost. In doing that, it would result in, anywhere between 40, 70 million going back to the districts, depending on how much money they would have paid with the bond or whatever school construction money, or especially hurricane money that goes out. Of course, that results in higher amounts being paid in.
So you're saying the schools for the total, for the state, could get 40 to 60 million back?
That's right.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's really the number
That's right.
about, okay.
The amount, though, that it would cost the state, because of the way that all these transactions occur, the additional funds that would have to be identified in order to do what we're requesting is around 20 to 25 million. I have a full spreadsheet over the last 10 years I can share with you that quickly shows how it has transitioned over time.
But did you receive a reason why it wasn't approved, or?
It simply comes down to funding. I haven't heard anyone that has questioned whether or not it's the right thing to do. I think it comes down to it being a budget item. I think a lot of people are surprised that we're not already getting the refund, and so I think, to Vice Chair Duncan's point, that's why it's very important to keep the conversation alive.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Holden.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Superintendent Johnson, I now recognize you for the superintendent's report.
Thank you. The screen's coming down. It looks like she stepped out. Want to give a big thank you to Pam Shue. A lot of work went on. Pam led a lot of great things in this building. We're excited for her next steps. Extremely grateful for all the work she put in for our K-3 literacy team, our early learning team, and some other things that we worked on that will become public later and will be exciting for next school year. So thank you, Pam. Briefly, do want to highlight, we sent out a news release about the U.S. Department of Education Green Ribbon Schools. Quite an honor to be awarded this designation. Not an easy feat at all. And you see here we have 3 schools in North Carolina that received this award. Also, speaking of something that's not easy to achieve, our new Principal of the Year will be coming and sitting with us. And great news as well, we're keeping Tabari here for your input as well. So we'll just have to, we can move away one of these chairs, and we can just make sure we have room for everybody. These don't always get much use, so. Some pictures. Always a great event, and of course, a huge thanks to all of our regional principals of the year. Every time we have Teacher of the Year, Principal of the Year ceremonies, it really is a true statement that any one of them could be the North Carolina Teacher or Principal of the Year. It just so happens that we can only have one for that year. So truly grateful for all of their leadership. Just some photos from a school safety visit we made to Porter Ridge High School in Union County. We started the school year off in Union County talking about school safety, so we wanted to end in Union County talking about what they have been working on, and had a great roundtable discussion, obviously talking about securing our schools, but of course the mental health issues that lead to school tragedies. And one innovative practice they do that is really great is they do more than just a simple meet with your advisor in your homeroom once every few months. They do this weekly. Teachers get to know their group of students who are their cohort, whether or not they're actually in classes together or not, and they actually talk about career pathways and success. And we made a real point to start our messaging on this day that will continue into the fall, that really every child should know that they have a pathway to success no matter what it is. And we're excited about encouraging students to value not only their life and their opportunity to reach their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, build a career and build a family, but also value others as well. And when everyone does that, it will lead to reducing bullying, reducing cyberbullying, and eventually what we have to do is we cannot accept in our society that these school tragedies are just something we have to live with. This is something we have to stop, and this is an important piece of the puzzle. Another important piece that we'll talk about later today. Did want to highlight the great work under Dr. Lynn Moody in the Rowan Salisbury School District. This was their launch of their renewal, getting that district more flexibility so they can use that flexibility and flexible curriculum, flexible way that they use what's allotted to them, flexible ideas around teaching. Again, we talk a lot about innovation, but this is innovation in practice, and it is wonderful that we were able to get flexibility from the state requirements for this district, and we're excited about seeing this in action, seeing it working, and getting this flexibility around the entire state. And then we asked them, they sent us some pictures that the school district had. And I believe we will have an update today on the Say Something app. So I will not go into the details of the Say Something app, but we had a great announcement, and here you see we were supported by, we had sheriffs, we had legislators. We're very excited about this. It's gotten great feedback from the community. Excited about being able to launch sometime later this year a tool that anyone in our community can use to report something suspicious, whether it could lead to a school tragedy or whether it's drug use or bullying or cyberbullying, or importantly, not just the concern of people hurting others, but people hurting themselves. We've heard the statistics that the teen suicide rate is going up, and there are a lot of things in society we can point towards causing that and concerns. But one thing we know is that if we can give an easy-to-use tool to students, if they're thinking about that, they can reach out to someone. And the important part of this, and again, I'll let them be able to explain it all. We're very excited about having a dedicated command center for North Carolina. So it is going to be specifically for North Carolina, trained professionals there. I joke that they will know how to pronounce some of the cities in eastern North Carolina, and that is a very important thing to do when you really need to know the difference between Henderson and Hendersonville. It's a big state, and we want to make sure that we have dedicated staff for our students. Importantly, when you see us rolling this out, people have asked why not elementary schools yet. I do tell people that's something we're going to look at. We could expand to elementary schools. Right now, for this first rollout, we've got to set it up correctly, and we want to make sure it's for the student voice. And right now, the main student voice we need to hear from are high schools and middle schools. We do not want to venture into having kindergarten, first grade, second grade students on iPhones trying to submit reports. That's something we need to investigate more, but very excited that this will be available for every middle school and high school, and anyone in the state will be able to download it and highlight one of those schools and report a concern. Oh, so thank you. Here's a list of just some of the people that joined us that day. Again, this is broad support. We're very excited about that. And then, just the last thing, I do more than just school visits. We actually had a great visit. I went out to Greenville, and we went to Grady White Boats. And boy, they are just an amazing place to work. And it's just looking into that those pathways that we are promoting, that you don't have to go to a four-year college to get a great career. We are getting that more and more out into the field. Teachers know that, parents know that. We're making that a reality. And this was just a fantastic place to work. You see here, we're gonna take some of their successful work habits and try to get that out to our students, because they're building an amazing culture here. But also, they do amazing things for their employees, such as they have a book program. So they have leadership books and improvement books, and if employees read them by a certain time, they get cash. So it's not just a feel-good, hey, we're all in this together. It's also incentivized, and as a result, they're an extremely strong company with very good results for the business, but also very good results for the people who work there. So the more of that we can have in North Carolina, the better, and I'm excited. just to be part of this work with you all to make sure students know those pathways. Thank you all.
Thank you, Superintendent. Any questions for our
I
Superintendent?
have a quick question.
Dr. Oxenberg?
Superintendent Johnson, will the students receive some kind of training, that's not the right word, some kind of little workshops on how to use the app?
Yes, am I correct? We have a presentation. Let's save that for the presentation on the app, and we can do all the questions. Yes, training's gonna be a huge part of this, to be able, not just for students, but also for staff. We're gonna get trainings out there to identify some of the warning signs around, particularly being able to notice if someone may wanna hurt themselves or hurt others. And again, one thing we're happy about the training, we're happy about the command center. Importantly, we're happy about being able to, if someone sees something and says something, connecting the dots with that information. Because we've seen too many instances where information was out there, but we didn't connect the dots with the right officials, getting that to the proper law enforcement, getting that to the proper mental health support. We're very excited about that.
Okay. So
But we will have a special presentation just
Very
on
good.
that.
Perfect.
Other questions? Okay, thank you, Superintendent.
Thank you all.
In order to align our agenda with actually an outside speaker on that topic, we're going to slightly change our agenda, and I'll call on Dr. Townsend Smith to give us an update concerning board policy SBOP 006.
Good morning, board members.
Morning.
Morning.
All right, so this morning, I want to talk to you about changes to SBOP 006. As you know, I help you oversee, along with the agency and with legal, changes to your policy manual. Specifically, I've been looking at those policies that are outlined within SBOP 00, the SBOP series, and many of them need to be revised. So over the coming months, I will be coming to you with 1 to 2 policies for suggested revisions. So my purpose for this presentation today is threefold. So the reasons for the changes in this policy, it is to provide clarity, technical changes, and alignment specifically to your current priorities, legislative mandates, and some archive mandates. So I'm going to go over the 4 specific changes that the policy represents. The specific policy recommended changes are outlined for you and are attached on eBoard, but I'm just going to review those for you broadly. So the first revision, I made some suggested changes to your strategic priorities. The ones that were there before did not align to how committees are currently structured. And so you will see that I tried to make the statement more elastic in case the board wants to add more priorities. So you have student learning and achievement, you have business operations, you have the strategic planning component, you have the global awareness. So you have a lot of priorities, and I just didn't feel that it was appropriate just to limit it to those things that we have outlined. I gave examples of those, but just pretty much struck that from policy, so that gives us a lot more room to breathe there, because the previous policies were outdated. The second revision I made were to the words chairman and vice chairman. I just felt that the chair and vice chair could be a female, so we just made those more aligned, and so just so that it wouldn't be limited to just male. So made that change throughout the policy. The third change that I made was with formatting. The policy contained like all caps in some areas, and I didn't really understand that, so I just made it more aesthetically appealing. So just change caps to just consistent changing throughout the policy. And then the fourth change that I made were things that would help us meet legislative mandates, because remember last year the legislature required that you do your voting by roll call, and other things that were outlined in the policy was how we did voting previously. and I just changed some language in there. We had some old, outdated references to policies that were either stricken from the books or the title of those policies had changed. So I made sure that those things were aligned for you. And so those were the 4 basic revisions that were made to the policy. I am asking that you approve this on action on first read so that we can ensure that things are aligned. Have taken it through Rules Council. They have reviewed it. Legal has put their eyes on it, so I think we are good and ready to go with this suggested policy revision. Any questions?
Questions on these policy changes? Any objection to action on first read today? All right, seeing none, so ordered. Thank you. Okay. And Dr. Townsend Smith, are we still on for 11:15, or can we do?
If we take a little break, I
Break.
could probably.
Yeah, all right. Then let's plan to, let's take a 15-minute break. We'll be back in session at 10:55.
They'll be ready in the next 10, 15 minutes, so you just give us a thumbs up, they'll be ready.
Okay. We're back at 10:55. Okay, we are back in session, and we will begin our committee reports. I remind committee chairs in the audience that all voting on consent and any item requiring action will be done at the end of the agenda via roll call. To begin our committee reports, I recognize Mr. Reginald Keenan, the new chair of the Healthy Responsible Students Committee. Mr. Keenan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Reginald Keenan, the chair of the HRS committee, along with my good friend Alan Duncan. And today we have two matters before us today. First, we have the issue session. We're dealing with safety update, and with that, we have Ms. Kim Martin here this morning, who will guide us through that information. I would say, as she's walking forward, that I'd like to take the privilege to tell her thank you for her service. I think it's the last one that she'll be before us. She's going to move on to other facets of her life. And of course, I want to say on behalf of the board, we thank you for your service as director of the Center for Safer Schools. And because of your efforts, we have schools, children are a lot safer. And again, I'd like to commend you for creating and help create the app that we're dealing with, where I think we're the second state in the country to have a statewide safety app because of your efforts and others. And again, thank you for your service, and we wish you the best as you move forward in your endeavors.
Well, thank you so much. And Joe's been calling it my swan song, and so I'm glad this is a song instead of a dive. And, we actually have the app, contract finalized. Really appreciate the state board finalizing and approving the contract. I have been very passionate about this project because I have teenagers and I know what they come home and talk about and the kind of information they want to share about safety at their schools. And as a former special education teacher, I know that students, know a lot and see a lot, and they need to be partnering with the adults at the school to keep schools safer, and this application will be a tool that schools can use to make that better happen. I'm very grateful to the staff here at the department. It took a lot of effort to go through the procurement process and talk with vendors and all that. Several months of not being able to say anything to you all, which wasn't much fun to have to come and say, sorry, procurement process. But our procurement staff, our legal staff, Chief of Staff Joe Mamoni really put in a lot of effort to push this through. And I think we're gonna be proud of what we have, and it's gonna serve our schools well. Every project has to have a champion. And I've been talking with state leaders about this for 4 years or more, and everybody agrees that it's a good concept. But until I brought the information to Superintendent Johnson, I did not have anybody who would say, I'm gonna get it done, provide the money, and I believe in this. So I like to give credit where credit's due, and State Superintendent Johnson, really owe a lot to him for pushing this forward and being the champion for anonymous reporting for students. One thing that we like to say to schools is, you're already doing this. You're already getting information from students and staff about school safety. And this is just another way to get it. So don't panic if you're not already doing it through a tool like this, because you're doing it in other ways, other means. And we need to continue those other means as well, including the relationships that students build with people at their school that they feel they can go and talk to. Our vendor is Sandy Hook Promise, as you all are aware. And this is also very fitting for this project because the Center for Safer Schools was started right after the tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. And of course, Sandy Hook Promise was founded as something good that came out of that terrible tragedy at the elementary school in Connecticut. And we heard from parents. Parents have actually are co-founders and managing partners in Sandy Hook Promise, and that's really special to have that connection with them. Tim McCurr is from Connecticut, is going to join me to do this presentation. He regrets they were not able to come back to North Carolina this week. They were here last week, and they'll be here in the weeks to come. And we hope that they'll have another opportunity to come and meet the board, and as the progress goes through implementation, and they can tell you how it's going and give you updates. But right now, Tim McChris, if we can get him on the screen. Do I need to push something?
He has to just show it, he has to show his.
Okay. And we'll go through the PowerPoint presentation that you all received. I'll go ahead and start with my part of the presentation, and Tim McChris will pick up as soon as they are able to connect.
They're connected, you don't have to just go. It needs to share their screen from their side, but things are connected.
Okay. So the first slide is the project goal. And you have that on your screen, but not on that screen right now. But basically, what's been driving us is the date of July 1, just really a month from now, when the Department of Public Instruction had to make the application available statewide. And we're pleased to say that with the contract and we've already had 3 meetings with our vendor, Sandy Hook Promise, and we're well along the way to meeting that goal and to getting information out to schools. We're hoping that by next week, because of course we're nearing the end of the school year, we'll be able to get something out to state superintendents, asking them to designate a contact person, for their district, who can be our primary contact person starting out for this project. And so that will, we're working on getting that out next week, and that'll be our first touch, with the districts, of course, going to the local superintendents first. We wanted to share and make sure it's understood kind of the legal requirements behind anonymous reporting. One of it is the data aspect of this. The data aspect is that all the data that is stored at each school and in the overall state system for Say Something, Anonymous Reporting App, is not subject to public records as the term public record is defined, and shall not be subject to inspection and examination under a general statute. So in other words, schools do not have to share any information about the data that they're receiving through the student tips with local reporters, with anyone really that would lead to the identity of the tipsters. We're hoping that general information will be able to be shared about how many overall bullying tips we received in the state, how many downloads of the system we've had in the state, but anything specific to a school or even a district that could lead to the identity, which needs to be anonymous for at least the person who submits the tip, will be protected. And our our schools need to know that, because this is not a, let's find out what students are saying about safety at your school situation. Some of the school roles were spelled out in the statute for implementing this program. Number one, this is for public secondary schools only. It is not for the elementary schools. Well, you may ask, what about a K through 8 school? Well, in a K through 8 school, we would primarily be training 6th through 8th grade people to receive tips, but if they did come in through elementary school students, they would be referred to that team, and we would still want to get those and investigate those. But this is for secondary school only, starting out. And schools have to share the information about the program with students. And Sandy Hook Promise has some great ideas about how to engage students. This is one of their specialty areas that we were really excited about. And also, schools have to train their staff who will be receiving the tips, responsible for the program, on how to do so. So if schools were to ask me what they need to be doing right now, ideally, and of course it's over the summer months when people need a break, but they need to be organizing within their school who needs to receive the tips, who's already receiving and dealing with school safety information at the school. Maybe the counselor, maybe the vice principal, the school resource officer. Just use those same people, do what's already working for you. But go ahead and organize this at the school, so we'll be ready when those student tips start coming in sometime in the fall. We're urging schools to identify some community partners that can support the program. For example, local law enforcement. If it's a life-threatening situation, you need to have those relationships, contact information, ready to reach out to them when needed. Community mental health partners. Pennsylvania, when they rolled this out, the greatest number of their tips were related to suicide and self-harm. So schools may really need to build those partnerships that they may already have, but even strengthen them in response to mental health concerns that they're already getting, but may increase through this tool. Thirdly, schools need to ensure that school staff is informed. Really, everyone could be, because anybody at the school could download the app. It's going to be on the Apple iTunes store. So janitor plays an important role, school bus driver, anybody at the school could download it, submit tips. So everybody needs to know about it and have some opportunities for training about school violence prevention. What are some of the warning signs we need to be looking for that would need a response? And again, our vendor has great programs that they're already doing across the country in this area. We have mental health first aid provided through Division of Health and Human Services, which is another great program. But staff need to understand what they need to be reporting, what they need to be looking for. And then lastly, but not least, students need to be trained about school violence prevention, what they need to be looking for, appropriate uses of the app. This is not funny, this is serious stuff. We're not trying to get somebody in trouble. Somebody may need help and may not be able to speak up for themselves. You can speak up for them and help keep your school safer. And again, our vendor specializes in all this, and they're going to do a great job with it. At this time, I'd like to hear from Tim McChris. He is the co-founder and the managing director of Sandy Hook probably coming to you from Newtown, Connecticut, and this is his part of the presentation, so hopefully it's all going to work that he's going to pick up from here. Tim, please introduce yourself.
Excellent. Thank you, Kim, so much. As mentioned, my name is Tim Makris, one of the co-founders here at Sandy Hook Promise, and I lead the entire Say Something anonymous reporting system that we eloquently call SARS at Sandy Hook Promise, and have been behind it since it began over 16, 18 months ago. Today, what I want to do is build upon what Kim just mentioned in terms of the framework of this anonymous reporting system to give you a sense and a good grounding and foundation as to what it is, how it works, and how is this going to be rolled out statewide. As we go through the presentation, you'll notice there'll be a lot of repetition. We do this on purpose because we want to make sure you leave this meeting with good messaging, good education about the program. And the way, since everybody here is in the education world, to do that is to repeat. So please don't be offended by it. It's just to make sure that you're getting the message and we're all walking out speaking and saying the same thing. Okay, so a quick summary for you. As you know, this is part of North Carolina law that this program is being put into place. As Kim has mentioned, it's being targeted to middle schoolers and high schoolers and the adults around them to allow them to submit their safety concerns anonymously that they're seeing amongst their fellow classmates and frankly, from time to time, the adults that are around them. Tips on this system that are submitted, use our app, use our website, or the child can call through our 24/7 hotline. And those tips that are submitted are immediately triaged at the other end by crisis counselors who are trained on how to manage crisis, trained on how to manage suicide ideation and any type of self-harm to help that child immediately if they're calling in for themselves. But they're triaging that, and our center is located down in Miami, Florida. Once our center triages these tips that are coming in, then we will send them back out to the appropriately assigned school and 911 dispatch when needed so that they can action against the tip. So it's a very smooth process of submission, triaging, delivering out to school and dispatch, and then having them act upon that tip, as Kim mentioned earlier, as they do today. As mentioned, we're very honored to be chosen by North Carolina to partner with you all. A little bit on our organization, we're very much focused on gun violence prevention and other forms of violence and victimization. We do that through teaching kids and adults how to identify, intervene, and get help for individuals who want to hurt themselves or others. And it's not always about physical hurt here. It's about verbal as well, because all of those things combined together for our nexus often create signs and touch points of someone at an extreme who may want to go in and be violent within their school. So it's very important you understand that all of this is a path of identifying at-risk behaviors that together create a puzzle that you put together to say, okay, this person may be at higher risk, so we need to do something about helping him or her out. The Sandy Hook Promise has been on board, obviously, since after the shooting. We started our programs in 2014. We've trained over 7 million students at this stage and adults, and we're in over 15,000 schools, just to give you a sense of the scale of the organization. With that, of course, has come countless, and I mean countless, interventions of school violence, of school shootings, abuse, human trafficking, drug use, depression, anxiety, self-harm, so on and so forth. We truly have saved lives, and that's no exaggeration, where parents and schools have come to us and said, because of your programs, we've been able to stop a child from hurting themselves or others. This program, as mentioned, will launch later on this fall. We'll have exact timing on that shortly. We're just finalizing some details on how your state is structured and how we can roll this out. But nothing will take place in the state in terms of a live launch until we get your 911 dispatch, your school teams, our crisis center staffed up to support this. Testing, we test the program before we launch. And then finally, we train the kids. We always train the kids last because once you train them, you're live. So they will be the last folks in the process of onboarding us for the state. We anticipate that the program will generate between 24,000 and 49,000 tips. You may be saying, whoa, quite the range. It is quite the range because it's predicated on the level of school participation and very, very, very importantly, training the kids. If you don't train your kids, honestly, we tell states don't bother doing the program because you will not get the response and the protections that you're looking for if you don't train the kids. So that's where that wide range comes from. Is always some schools decide not to do it, most do, but we can't impress upon you more that we have to train the kids in order for the program to be effective. Now, we are not a one and done in terms of how we deliver our programs. So we sustain this program in schools through embedding the Say Something Anonymous reporting system in an existing student club or by creating a new student club. The good news is that North Carolina, sadly, because of a shooting that took place years ago, some parents established the SAVE Club, Students Against Violence Everywhere. We acquired them 2 years ago and have thousands of clubs across the U.S. So we'll provide for schools who don't have a club, turnkey, how to establish a SAVE Club, all the steps, all the activities, the calendar, et cetera, to empower those kids. So that's the summary through sustaining. And we want you to know for your part, to implement this program, each school district, they have to establish a high-level district team, so a team that kind of oversees their district, or in the case of charter schools, is overseeing their school or schools that may be involved. And they need to establish individual teams within each school of the district to participate. So that would be all the middle schools and high schools, or if there's combination schools of K to 8, it would be someone that would cover grades 6 to 8 in some of those combi schools. Will require that the schools establish a lead who we will deal with in this launch. So from the very early days all the way through to post-launch, we require one person to be designated as the lead for their district, for their charter school, for us to be able to communicate and for them to help us coordinate trainings and scheduling trainings and that sort of thing. It's a key best practice. It's an incredible way of getting information out into the schools by having it go through one individual so that there's no misinformation or misunderstandings. And that individual is also coordinating with their respective operations director or superintendent so that they're well informed as well. We really need your support. Part of the onboarding here is to inform you, but to turn you into ambassadors as you go back out to talk about the strength of the program and what it can do for schools. So that's the summary, folks. Now what I want to do is quickly walk you through the details behind all of these bullets, and then we'll close it out with, again, the actions that we need you to take. So the framework. First and foremost, there are 3 steps to this program. First one is submitting a tip using those platforms I mentioned earlier, app, website, 24/7 hotline. Next, our crisis center processes that tip and triages it and gets it ready to be delivered out to the schools. And then finally, it is delivered to the schools that have been impacted, or a school that's been impacted, and when needed, also to a local 911 dispatch so they can get local police or sheriff assistance. Step 3 is, as the schools do today, they're there to assess and intervene and take action as needed, and then close the tip out once they've taken those actions so that everybody can be assured that steps were taken and those steps were recorded. So step 1, you see on the screen is, these are actual graphics and everything that we use of the app, website, and the hotline. We please ask everyone, this system is live, but it's not live for North Carolina. So we don't want folks to be downloading the app and to start sending tips in because we're not fully staffed for that. Now, I want to give you the assurance, if in the off chance that people do that and they're sending in tips, of course we're able and we're ready to be able to manage those tips. But we don't want to broadcast to folks, hey, go start submitting tips now. So that's where we're going with that statement. So you see the 3 platforms there. The key takeaway on this page is, for every child, every adult who submits a tip, they must always associate themselves with the school that's impacted. And 99% of the time, it's the school that they go to. So when they use those platforms, they associate themselves immediately with the school. And that's why the system lists every single solitary school in the state of North Carolina, so they can find that school and associate themselves with it. These are some of the topics that the kids will be submitting in and around. And in yellow, you'll see there that there is a list of the top 10 that we typically get from kids from around the country, just to give you a sense. So number 1, bullying, cyberbullying, that cutting and self-harm is number 2, and then the third one is suicide ideation. So those are the top 3, and it really comes down to incidents, right? So unfortunately, suicide, the incidence, especially amongst young women, is very high. So we get a lot of tips, we get a lot of intervention in that space. Okay, so that's step 1 in kind of a sense of what kids are submitting. Now, what happens with that tip? So step 2, the first thing that we do is we triage the tip. So our crisis counselors gather as much information as they possibly can from the tipster. Sometimes when the tipster submits, everything's perfect and we can roll. Other times we need to gather more information. If we're on the phone with them, of course we can ask them questions, but we can tell you about 97% of the time, kids are going to use the app or they're going to use the website. So by using those 2 forms, they're writing everything down, right? They're typing it in. So we can have anonymous 2-way communication with them to gather more information and to make that tip more actionable, perhaps, than how they submitted it. The next action we take in step 2 is we then categorize it. And this is really important because this is a big differentiator for your schools, for your police, to really help where and how that tip is going to be processed. So the counselor decides, based on the information, is this a life safety tip or a non-life safety? And as you can imagine from those words, life safety is there something imminent, life-threatening, in progress, or something just occurred that typically we say need the involvement of police. If none of that is in play, then it becomes a non-life safety tip. And as you'll see in a minute, when it's in the gray zone, often we'll make a pre-call out to the school to gather a little bit more information if they have insights that will help us decide if the tip will go non-life safety or life safety. These are examples, and I know this is probably hard based on where you are in the room, but we circulated the presentation for you. But these are just examples of what life safety tips are on the left and some of the non-life safety events or types on the right. Now, let's get to that gray zone. So when we have tips come in that we're like, it's in the middle, it could go either way, we like to reach out and have a conversation with the schools that will help us bring more clarity to the role, to the tip that's being submitted. This is really important, and let me tell you why. Especially around suicide ideation, sometimes a child on social media is learning about an incident about a friend. They're making a threat to hurt themselves, but they might have learned about it late. So let's say they learned about it at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, but somebody else submitted the tip at 4 o'clock. So often, based on the language and us gathering information from the tipster, if we think, oh, wait a minute, this may have been reported already, or maybe from the sounds of it, they're them saying, well, the school's aware that she's done this before, we'll reach out to the school and have a conversation. The reason why we do that is we don't want to re-traumatize a child by making it life safety, getting the police involved, and having cars roll to a home when it's not necessary. So we take that very seriously. The police appreciate it because they want to use their time wisely. The parents appreciate it because we're only sending out police and that sort of thing when it's necessary. So to give you a sense, that collaboration on average takes us 4 minutes. And that's incredibly important. So we don't just throw things over the wall, I guess is the message here. We really take it serious to make sure it's actionable and it's appropriate when we involve the police into a situation. Okay, the third action that we take is now that we've got it triaged, we've got it categorized, it's time to send this thing out. So now we'll deliver that tip formally via text, email, and or phone call to the school team and to 911 dispatch when they're needed. In terms of these school teams, the teams are going to be, as mentioned earlier, a district level team that kind of oversees the entire district. And then we're going to need individual teams in each school because they're closest to the students. They have the pulse of what's going on. We'll need those individual teams to be on board as well to receive an action against the tips. In the middle there, you see kind of a representation of typically who are on those teams. And then you need to know we'll work behind the scenes as we do in every state, every district across the U.S., to connect the appropriate 911 dispatch center with the appropriate school because timing is incredibly important. So we need to make sure all connections are working properly. So this chart here gives you a sense of how that information flows. So again, we triage the tip, we collaborate if needed, and then categorize the tip. And then for life safety tips on the left-hand side in red, we'll call 911 dispatch and do a verbal intake with them. They've been trained on this platform. They can open up the platform and see all the information for themselves. And then on the right side there, you see we'll call, text, and email the school team because we need to alert them as to what's going on, especially if it's during school hours, what's going on and what's been received from a life safety tip. And again, they would turn to the platform, sign in, and be able to look at the information. If it's a non-life safety tip, then that's simply being sent to the school via email and text for them to deal with. It's not an emergency. They can get to it throughout the day and follow up with the child as needed. We want everybody to know that this program is 24/7. It needs to be. These kids at any moment can be reading something on social media or hearing something in the halls or outside of school, and they need to submit it. And we've all probably read of plenty of instances across the country where there's been interventions thanks to kids paying attention and reporting these things. So what's important to know about 24/7 reporting as during non-school hours, we need those school teams, the district-based team or the school-level team, we need them to provide the student's address. It's very, very important. 911 dispatches do not have student addresses. So if we have a child who's saying, hey, next day I'm coming in and I'm shooting up the school, we had that in Connecticut and we had it in Pennsylvania recently. It was late night when it was posted. We had to get a hold of the school to find out where the child was so police could roll and have a discussion, with that child and with those parents about that posting. So you can see for life safety, the importance of that. For non-life safety, again, we send it out between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. typically, and there's no need to bother people in the middle of the night for that. All right, so that's step 2. We've triaged, we've categorized, we've sent it out. Now step 3 is what folks do today. That team assesses, intervenes, and takes actions based on their own policies. And then, of course, law enforcement gets involved as needed. Then the school team closes out that tip, and they're going to document the actions that they took. That way there's a record that can be seen. And understand that this program, and the beauty of what North Carolina and other states are deciding to do, is that we'll keep the information for a minimum of 7 years, because over that time frame, if a child moves from district to district, or there's a continued level of at-risk behavior, you're going to be able to begin to connect the dots and decide if more steps need to be taken with a given individual to make sure he or she is safe, and most certainly not at a point where they want to hurt others around them. And the reason why that's in place and important for everybody to know is for the extremes of school shooting and school violence, there's no profile. There's only connections that you can make in behaviors that then you decide and use your judgment to say, hey, we need to go to do a further threat assessment on this individual to make sure they're safe. If you don't have a record of connections, then it's very difficult to see that and take action. And if you look at what happened out in Colorado at a school site there a few years ago, the report that came out said explicitly, because they didn't have a record of connections, they missed what was right in front of them about this young man who was building up, and eventually, took out his frustrations by shooting within the school. All right, our program operates on a web-based framework, and that framework is connected, as you'll see, to everybody who engages with it. So that platform allows the tip submissions to take place on those 3 platforms that I mentioned, the app, website, and telephone hotline. It allows the crisis center to interact and put information, school and dispatch teams, the tipster, of course, and then, of course, it allows the schools to report on actions taken, as just mentioned. This platform is available in mobile, and of course it's available for you to use on laptop, whatever, PC, pads, iPads, that sort of thing. But I can tell you, most schools, about 95% of the folks that we work with just use their phone, and then they'll hop in for a couple of small things onto the full website. So what you see on this slide now is just how that platform interacts. The beauty of the program is everything is live. So when the tipster is talking, everybody who's on the platform can see that conversation take place. And if they choose, after we go through established protocols that we train everybody on, then they can jump in and talk to the tipster. If the school wants to talk to dispatch, there's a separate private area for them to talk to dispatch and talk to the crisis center. It's all interwoven so that there is no misinformation and people understand the actions that are being taken in real time. And of course, so they can share information real time. Now let's talk about anonymity, because this question often comes up in presentations like this. So this is an anonymous-based program. In fact, we use external gateways to be able to block IP addresses and that sort of thing that come through, because otherwise you don't have an anonymous system if it's easy for us to simply go in and capture this information. We want you to know that the information is owned by the school district. We don't own the information. We just follow your state laws and federal laws when it comes to privacy. If an individual calls in first person, so they're calling in for themselves, and they're suicidal, they're ideating, or in some other danger, as you all may or may not know, we're protected by governing law to be able to break anonymity if needed to help that individual. We get about 1 to 0.5% of our calls that come in first person, and yes, we have had plenty of interventions on kids to help them out, so it does work. This last bullet is important. If an individual abuses the system or breaks your state or federal law, the district, right, or the charter school, they can request a court order to try and uncover anonymity. We say try because it's all in the timing, and we provide the local police and that school an IP address for them to work with providers to track that child down. But we need everybody to hear loud and clear. Our organization will not provide anything without a court order. Because again, if it's that simple to break anonymity, then you really don't have a system and the kids aren't going to use it. And to give you a sense, I think if we've had 7 inquiries in the last year and a half, I'm probably exaggerating, and that's with well over 25,000 tips that have come in. All right, reporting rates, because you hear all this information, I'm sure you're sitting there going, wow, is this going to be too much for the state, for my given district, etc.? We want to let you know that about 3 to 6% of the students who are trained in the program will submit a tip on average during the school year. Okay, school year of 180 days. We're being conservative because we're excluding weekends and vacations and holidays, but that's typically what we're seeing out there. And then note that in the first 30 days or so, your rates will be much higher because we just train the kids and they have what's called latent tips that they didn't know what to do with before, but now that they have the system, they're able to submit it and get help for their friends. About 18 to 25% of the tips that we receive will be life safety tips. And about 10 to 15% of those will be very serious. We call them saves, where we were able to truly intervene and save that child's life. For the summertime, you get a massive drop. The kids basically walk away from it during that period, so we don't have to worry about overwhelming schools, officials, and that sort of thing, because truly the numbers drop like a rock during the summertime. And then finally, in terms of hoaxes, yep, unfortunately they're out there. But typically our hoaxes are fairly harmless. There are things like clowns have red hair, or sadly the kids make fun of a teacher or somebody just to kind of test the system out. We've had one incidence of a kid calling in a false report, and the school did take action, and they did press charges against the child because they broke state law in submitting a false report. But otherwise, we've had a very, very good track record here because we really reinforce with the kids the seriousness of this program when we go out and train them. So quickly, this just gives you a sense of what the numbers will look like and how I got to that 24,000 to 49,000 and some of those variables that are going to influence these numbers. So there is no exactness, but as we get closer and closer and closer to launch and understanding how many kids were trained, we really can get very accurate on what to anticipate in terms of tips. And then finally, sustaining. So I mentioned that we're not, an organization that throws it over the wall. We pay for a vast majority of this program to be brought into states and districts across the U.S., and we want to make sure the programs stick because for obvious reasons, we want impact. So we established and asked the schools to establish a SAVE club or to embed SARS in an existing club. And the reason why we do that is we know that kids will run with it. We know that they'll do activities, they'll have call to action weeks to reinforce the program. We've had more Oklahoma, every time that they do a lockdown drill or active shooter drill, they immediately get on the announcement and they reinforce the Say Something program with the kids, because while their mindset is there, they say, hey, if you want to stop this, don't forget to say something. And they walk through the steps again with the kids to reinforce the importance of being observant, looking for those behaviors, and reporting them. We also believe in making sure schools inside the schools have plenty of materials to promote the program. So we provide materials to the schools on the program, so floor stickers, posters, that sort of thing. They won't ruin anything on the floors, don't worry about it. We've tested everything. So we do that because incidents isn't every day with the child. So when it does happen, we want to remind them gently, hey, don't forget to say something. And then finally, we support the entire state through both in-state and virtual school outreach coordinators, so folks who are on the ground that will go in and out of the schools in these out years to make sure they have what they need to sustain the program. And every year you'll get a new class of 5th graders going to 6th graders, as well as out-of-state transfers and new administrators who are learning the program. So we provide all the materials and the abilities to get those folks trained so that we can get them up and running quickly at the beginning of each school year. All right, so the framework within that school setup, we have to have all the schools in there. So if you hear these requests going out over the coming weeks and you're getting feedback, we've got to get all the information into that platform, right, that I mentioned earlier. So we have all schools, all positions, all names listed in there. And thankfully, your state is incredibly organized. So that should be pretty easy for us to do. The next big thing is we've got to get a lead. So every district, every charter school has to have a lead for us to work with to help coordinate the rollout of this program. So that's our first big step here that's coming over the next 7 to 10 days of reaching out to superintendents and operations directors and getting them to assign someone to this project. That lead has all administrative rights to make sure that the team is set up properly, all their schools are set up properly, etc. So that's their responsibility in working closely with us. As mentioned earlier, everybody has to sign in to use this system. And the reason why we do that is we audit everything that takes place on the system. So there's a trail out there, just given, of course, these are life-saving programs, so we need to do that. And we have to protect privacies, right? So we need to know who's in the system and what they're doing in the system. God forbid if there's an issue around privacy. And as mentioned, we do store up to 7 years or more, so we can find those connections over the years for individuals who may be at a higher risk of hurting themselves or others. All right, so that's the framework, that's the background, that's the foundation of the program and how it works and how it operates. The help that we need from you as you go out and leave this meeting is to review and discuss it with just fellow, education officials who you work around, because the biggest issue that we know with this program is getting ahead of misinformation and making sure people are informed properly and that they understand what the program does and how it operates. If we're able to do that, you will have an incredible launch, very similar to what Pennsylvania just had. If we don't do that together as a team, then unfortunately we'll waste time trying to put out fires because people are speaking and sharing the appropriate facts about the program. So over the next 7 to 10 days, we'll be reaching out to superintendents to begin this process. You don't have to get ahead of us. If you're going back out and you're speaking with folks, just know that that first correspondence is coming, and then after that, honestly, the floodgates begin to open as information begins to flow throughout the state. So take that time, maybe reach out to them and others after that first window if you feel you can reinforce the importance of the program. Along those lines, if you have any questions, please, please, please come to us. Joe or Kim offline, I suspect, will share with you some emails, and obviously the relationship you have with them, you can contact them directly. But we want to answer your questions, but please let us answer those questions so you get the facts and you have what you need to help someone who may be asking you questions. And as mentioned, be that ambassador. Folks, there's no exaggeration. This program has saved thousands of lives. And in your state, we're going to do the same exact thing. We need folks to reinforce the importance of this program, of any anonymous reporting system, quite frankly, and the impact that it can have in a given state. So next year, I hope I have the honor to be able to get on the phone with you in June and say, look at what this program has done, look at the impact that it has done, but we will tell you, if folks don't participate, if students don't get trained, it's just not going to happen. It's black and white, it's fact. So we really got to get folks enthused between now and early fall to get them involved with the program and get those trainings done if they really want to feel the effect in all the work and frankly support and lobbying that Kim did to get this program through, and other states around the U.S. who are doing it and having great success. We've got to get folks on board. So that's really the big need right now, is getting that out there and getting people rolling and engaged in the program. And in the spirit of time, I'm going to skip this, but I have a video here that offline you can take a look at. It's a rough cut. A rough cut means we haven't finished editing it, but I wanted to share it with you. But offline you can take a look at it. It'll be part of the presentation. And it basically shares with you schools and administrators from around the country and some of the successes they had, as well as just a quick explanation of the program. So as you go out in the coming weeks, you'll have a small little short video that you can share. That's it for me, and I'll pass it back to you all if you have questions, if time permits. Otherwise, thank you for allowing me to present this to you.
Ms. Moore?
Yes, so I'm proud in North Carolina that we are organized and we have great relationships with some of the key partnering agencies like Emergency Management, Public Safety, Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, and I hope everybody is aware of this program and has bought into this program, and we're going to work together with schools to support this. We have a task force for safer schools that Alan Duncan and Freebird sit on, and they include all these different parties that will be stakeholders in this group. And you all are our first key stakeholder that we have presented this to because of your importance to this. And I know that we're going to be reaching out to other organizations. I'm going to go over to the Governor's Crime Commission this afternoon, and there'll be several other organizations that we need to get this information out to at the state level. And with a lot of the summer conferences going on with school counselors, school psychologists, we hope to get in there and share this information. I pass it back to you in case there are any questions, sir.
Anyone, questions, comments from the board?
I have a couple of questions. this has been very informative because I asked about the training before the break. So this is the kind of information I needed in order to come up with a list of questions. I'm not going to ask them all today. I'll ask them along the way. My first question is, must these clubs exist in order to be a part of the initiative? Must the school, I think it's called Schools Against Violence or Safe School Clubs, are these required? Is this a required component? My related question is, I would like to see the material. Is there material that is provided to the students? Do they have bylaws? Do they have goals, objectives, so on and so forth? And I'm going to be very candid and ask, I would hope that these clubs are politically neutral, that they are in response to, let's say, supporting the standard course of study around healthful living only and promoting saving lives. I just hope that there isn't some kind of hidden agenda, and I just needed to say that. The other question has to do with this. I know the importance of gathering additional information from the student who submits a tip, and I may have heard this incorrectly, but if there's a follow-up call to the student during the school day, I think that would be intrusive. Could intrude in the instructional day. And I understand the importance of the need for a detailed information, so I'll set that aside. But still, I think it could be intrusive in the school day. I think it could cause the student to have to be pulled away from instruction. The student's mind would be focused someplace else. I just have a wealth of questions. It's not to say that I'm against the initiative, but I do have questions.
Tim, I'll start, and if you wanted to chime in, I believe it's texting back and forth is what we're talking about. If they send a tip in on the app with information about a student or concern, the person on the other end may come back and say, do you have a last name for this person? Do you know which school bus they ride in? It's just a texting back and forth to get more information. Those students that call in, and there's very few who actually call in to the tip line, evidently, but those are the ones that'll have a sustained conversation with a trained crisis counselor. And I doubt they'll be doing that during the school day, but they might, and if they did, it's hopefully because they're in a major crisis or something and need to talk with someone immediately. But most students do use the app because they're on their phones. That's kind of their world and where they live, and so it might be a texting back and forth situation, more so than talking in the middle of class or something. And this being 24/7, students could know that they could do this during lunch, after school, in the evening. That's kind of the beauty of it. And
Stats back that up. 11 to 1, 4 to 8 is the vast majority of tips that come in.
But do teenagers' phones actually receive calls? Because I've got some kids to talk to in my family.
and I text mine back and forth. I find that more effective. In follow-up to the clubs, I know that they have an infrastructure of the SAVE clubs, but I'm hoping, and I'll make this request, a lot of schools have bullying prevention clubs, other clubs that are set aside that address school safety. I would think that it would be optimal to work through those already existing clubs that students are already familiar with, rather than start up new ones. So I'll definitely make sure that is emphasized, because we want to use those existing student clubs that students are already tuned into.
That's good.
Yeah, and I just want to build on what you said about the clubs as well. The state clubs are North Carolina based. That's where they started, so there's plenty of places for folks to reach out and get a sense of how they operate. Sandy Hook Promise, let's just get it on the table. We're not into gun control, We're not into gun stuff. We're not into any of that. Our record speaks for itself. It's very easy to check that out, Google us, whatever you need to do, and we can provide the safe materials. Our feeling is we're the human side of gun violence, and that's going after the individual behind the gun, and we'll leave that other stuff to the political circus that takes place on guns. That's just not our world. So don't worry about that piece. Safe clubs focus on things like school violence, victimization, bullying, texting and driving, and other topics that the kids want to take up to help protect their school. They do not get into politics.
Thank you very, very much.
That's what,
Can you just jog my memory? How long is this initial contract? How many years?
It's a 1-year contract with the ability to renew it for 4 additional years. I said that right in the procurement world.
Thank you.
anyone else? Again, Ms. Martin, thank you very much for your,
Oh, I just would be remiss, I keep looking right here for Miss Willoughby. I know this was I guarantee you she's not listening. After 18 years, but I do, this was important to her. I appreciate your partnership with her. She felt a lot of urgency about this and safety, and I just appreciate in her absence all the work she did on this as well, so
thank you very much. Mr. Chair, the only other matter we have was consent item. That was for policy amendment to the middle school athletic manual. With that, that concludes our committee reports.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Keenan. I now turn to Dr. Oxendine, Chair of the Educator Standards and Practice Committee, for her report.
Thank you, Chairman Davis. I am Olivia Oxendine, and I chair the Educator Standards and Practice Committee, and joining me in that responsibility is Ms. Amy White. We have a issues item on the agenda today, and it will be led by Dr. Tomberlin. And you do have the PowerPoint in your e-board location. It deals with licensure operations, a topic that we occasionally talk about here around the board table. So this is an update on what's happening in the world of licensure operations and how the function of the operations looks in terms of an organizational structure. So enough said, Olivia. I will turn it over to Dr. Tomberlin.
Dr. Oxendine. Good morning, board members. Good morning. So predictably, I am here to talk about licensure, but with a little twist. This is about operations and not policy. So I'd like to, back in May, we received a final report from what's called the STAR team from the Keenan-Flagler School of Business at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And this was a team of prospective MBA students that examined our licensure processes for ways that we can improve efficiency and productivity. I have to say that it is simultaneously exhilarating and humbling to be in a room full of extremely talented millennials telling you how to be better at your job. It was quite an experience that we really learned a lot from, and I want to share some of those high-level findings with you today, and introduce a new team member to the licensure section. First, I would like to extend a thank you to Christopher Gosk, the faculty member, and Christopher is in the audience with us, faculty member from the Keenan-Flagler School of Business, who directed, I guess we could say you directed, I don't know what one does with folks like this, but he oversaw this study, and we're most appreciative to him for the manner in which it was conducted. You will receive the full report. I am just going to go over the highlights with you today. So I do urge you to look at all the bios of these wonderful folks. They have left us. They could not be here today because they went on and they're helping Amazon and Walmart and other multinational corporations improve their processes as well. So we're glad we got them to help us before they went on. So the goals of this I don't know what to call it really, a study, I don't want to say audit, but of this initiative were threefold. First, to reduce the average processing time of applications. Second, to increase the efficiency and licensure approval of the licensure approval process. And third, to increase the visibility surrounding license approvals. And so all three of those things will certainly help in not only processing licenses faster, but also help in the public perception of the licensure department and how it works within the department. So in order to really understand how well we're doing, we looked to some other states near us for what their processes were. And so we selected 5 that were fairly similar to us in size and geography, and they served a comparable number of students in their state. They also have a similar size education budget. And so we felt this was a good comparison to see how well we were doing as in terms of benchmarking. What we learned is we're holding our own with most other states, and we also learned some of the ways they organize their licensure departments for maximum efficiency. So the first finding was about informing folks about the requirements for a license in the state of North Carolina. A lot of our specialist time is consumed by answering questions, and those questions could be easily answered if we had a web page that was much more reflective of the current licensing requirements. Now, this is a challenge for us because our current system requires a lot of process in order to change content. And as you all are painfully aware, we bring our general licensure requirements policy to you about every month. And so keeping up with that kind of change is really difficult for us in the department. The good news is that we're moving to a new platform for our web pages that we, the licensure department, will be able to update ourselves rather than submitting work orders through the agency. And so that should help us improve the content and keep the content timely for those looking to come to North Carolina to teach. We also want to expand the application experience. We have some exciting partnerships going on related to teacher recruitment and licensing that we hope we're going to be able to bring you information about in the coming months. But what the team found was that by making these adjustments, by better educating teachers about what the requirements are, that could result in a 22% increase in the processing capacity of our licensure staff, especially during the peak season when everyone's putting in. In other words, if people's applications contain all the necessary documentation up front, then we can process those licenses much faster. The next area was for us to protect the time of our specialists, and this is a reflection of the fact that we have 8 full-time specialists. We have 8 full-time positions for licensure specialists, and on any given day, 2 of them are dedicated to customer service, taking calls. And so that reduces our workforce by 25% right there because they're dedicated to taking calls rather than processing licenses. And so one of the recommendations from this team was to, there was 2 recommendations, an either-or situation. One, we could establish full-time call-in windows. So there are dedicated days to when applicants could call in. So I can say that folks like Tennessee establish Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 9 to 5 as their call-in days. And they don't take calls on any other days, and that protects Tuesdays and Thursdays for all their licensure specialists to work on clearing licenses. I think there's a trade-off there. There's nothing more frustrating than calling and saying, please call back another day. So the other option would be to have additional staff that's dedicated to customer service calls. They're not licensure specialists. They're devoted totally to taking and receiving calls and really having a strong customer service orientation towards those callers. Either way we go with this, the team indicated that the processing times could be reduced by 12 to 18, or reduces application processing time by 12 to 18% and increases processing capacity up to 13%. And so this seems like a pretty easy solution to increase our productivity quite a bit. Then there was the structure. So the structure of the licensure department, what we found in other agencies was there was a much more hierarchical structure to the licensure department. They may have had the same number of licensure specialists, but they had much more mid-level management to ensure that all the processes were running smoothly. One thing in particular that they pointed out was to hire a business analyst. And so we are very sensitive to that recommendation and are working to move forward on that. Having access to the data and constantly having data reported back out to the licensure specialists about our progress, about our productivity and our efficiency is important in improving those metrics. Establish performance reviews. Of course, we do have performance reviews as part of being state employees, but making sure that those performance reviews focus on meeting productivity goals and efficiency goals and reviewing those as part of that process. And then finally, hiring additional specialist staff, full-time or temporary. So we know that there are peak seasons in the licensure world and in the processing, and we're getting ready to enter one of those peak seasons. And so hiring additional support can help us move through those times more efficiently. It is a bit of a challenge because the system itself takes a fair amount of training. So hiring temporary staff would actually have to begin a couple of weeks or even a month before the actual peak season began, so that they were up to speed on those processes. These changes could result in a 28% decrease in processing time and 40% increase in capacity. So we're really focusing on this particular recommendation. There are some real actionable recommendations here that we plan to move on. Part of that recommendation was making sure that there was someone overseeing the operations of the licensure department. And to that end, we have hired a manager of operations for the licensure department. Her name is Deetrice Jones, and I am happy to introduce her to you and let her talk briefly about her plans for the organization and efficiency of the department.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I would just like to introduce myself as Deetrice Jones. I was also a licensure specialist, so I have received this promotion and taken on these duties to lead licensure as they would need to go. So, our licensure goals. So, the licensure goals would consist of reallocating positions to expand the customer service staff. Tom has already touched on that a little bit. I would also like to monitor the efficiency of meeting the expected, right now, 6 to 8 week processing time frame. Facilitate the weekly check-in meetings, which I have been privy to do that since I've been on board, just checking in with the specialists and making sure that we are all on par with what we're expected to do to enhance their training and understanding of what we need to do in licensure as well. Also to partner with our RALC directors to serve as field-based support to our school systems like the LEAs and charter schools. This is our licensure organizational chart. This is how we are now established with Susan Ruiz still as our licensure section chief. Deatrice Jones, a licensure program supervisor. As of right now, I have 7 full-time specialists, and as you can see, we have 1 vacant licensure specialist position. That would be the one that I used to uphold. I'll also like to bring your attention to the vacant CSR positions, in which we are in progress right now of bringing in at least 4 of those positions to help with the high peak season time, and they will be dedicated to customer service, as what Tom was referring to.
I have a quick question, if I may ask. How long have those yellow spaces been vacant?
Would you like to respond to that?
A long time?
Are you referring to the vacant CSRs?
So, the ones on the 5 on the left, the other right, most of those have been within the last 6 to 8 months. We have been going through an exercise of reclassifying those. They used to be what we refer to as PAs. This was back in the day where we had about 75,000 applications that came in through the U.S. Postal Service and the mail center, and these people had to open and sort and scan. So we've recently, within the last 6 to 8 months, been through the process of reclassifying those to update the skill set for the current technological requirements.
Are they posted?
Yes, ma'am. I did interviews last week. We're going through Temp Solutions, so I've already extended an offer to 2 of those that I have interviewed.
Thank you. Sorry for the intrusion, I just had to ask. Go ahead.
Did anyone else have any questions?
Other questions from my colleagues?
Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you, and welcome.
Thank you.
Or congratulations, I should say.
Oh, thank you.
So finally, the implementation of the recommendations and their impact on our licensure process. So, of course, some of these recommendations come with cost. And if you look there, there's a breakdown of the web design would be a non-recurring cost. The MicroPack contract, those are some enhancements to the system would be a non-recurring cost, but the recurring costs there are mostly personnel. And so hiring an analyst, the other full-time specialist, and perhaps some part-time specialists. So we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000 to implement these changes, these recommendations. And of course, the impact is quite large. 58% increase in capacity, 31% decrease in processing time, and I think most importantly, improve visibility and transparency in the licensure process to build the reputation of the department among the field as being a service to and not an impediment to. And so we really want teachers to view us as the place that they come to for assistance with their professional lives, not as a source of frustration. And we hope that this increase in employee and educator satisfaction will, help the overall general reputation of the agency. And then finally, just to put it into actual days, the actual average processing time for a license is 42 days. So that's roughly 8 weeks. The STAR team estimates that if we implement these changes, that we could reduce that to about 29 days, which is a pretty significant reduction in processing time for our applicants. And so we look forward to that, and if it's not exactly that much, we'll be very upset with our, with the report. And so this just looks at, this is for you to understand the recommendations that were made by the team, and the size of the circle indicates the impact that this would have on the licensure process. And then the line, the continuum, is from how easy those are to implement to how difficult those are to implement. And so you can see at the far edge, this additional staffing, of course, is the hardest thing to implement because it takes time and a lot of process on the licensure department to get those folks in here, get the right folks in. But in the end, it would yield the greatest impact to our processing time. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Are there questions from my colleagues? This is an important study. Mr. Buxton?
Thank you. 42 days right now. What's it been what's our trend line on that past couple of years?
I think when they did this analysis, they went back a couple of years, and so that's looking at the data over a number of years. 42 has been the average, and I know that that is an average. There are some outliers there, and I think it's when we hear about issues with licensure, it's the outliers that get called out, not the average. So there are instances where it's been 3-4 months where licenses haven't cleared, certainly, but the vast majority of them are clearing in about 8 weeks.
And then I think that last chart was getting to it, and if I just missed it in the comment, timeline for putting these changes into place.
So as Ms. Jones indicated, these customer service representatives, they're being brought on a temporary basis right now, largely to deal with they're going to assist with the peak season initially until we can get them trained and into their formal roles as customer service representatives. I think on this we see 5 customer service representatives. Given this report's finding, I think our idea is to repurpose one of those into the business analyst. And so we have the position, just repurposing that position to meet that recommendation.
Okay. Madam Chair, I'm not suggesting we go back to the days where the licensure wait times used to be posted on a poster in the boardroom.
I do remember.
But
my name was there many times waiting for my.
Yeah.
And a business analyst would help us do just that, what you're suggesting.
Yeah, but I do think you could probably find this in the minutes of state board meetings for the last 20 years because it's so important to our customers and in our recruitment and retention challenges.
It is a great way, to make improvements in the area of processing a license and getting it in the HR office and an LEA and then on to payroll so that the teacher sees it in his or her check. And that's going to improve image of all that we are about in this room. Good work. So we're going to get recommendations, formal recommendations?
So the report does contain recommendations that you can review, and we will keep you. We can certainly come back and report on our progress on those recommendations and how we're moving forward.
Any a need for exposure of the recommendations to Pepsi? Is that needed, do you think?
I think we will probably share that with them, as well as, so after every state board meeting, we're having webinars with HR directors, and this is certainly something we'll share at that webinar tomorrow with the statewide.
Thank you so much. Good report. Thank you, Dr. Tomberlin. Moving on to the other items on the agenda. Yesterday we had 2 presentations on pedagogical assessments that are required in SB 599. We heard from Kelly Crawford from the Pearson Corporation, and Pearson is responsible for publishing and making available scoring, collecting data, getting it back to our EPPs for the EdTPA. The UNC schools use the EdTPA. Our independent private schools are using the PPAT, and the presenter for the PPAT, the Praxis Performance Assessment Test, which is educational testing service, was Mr. Ethan Allen. a very, very good report, a necessary report to bring us up to speed and make us aware of these two important assessments that prepare our teacher education candidates in the area of strong pedagogical practices and knowledge. So that was excellent, and thanks to the staff for pulling that together, Kim and Andrew and Tom. Action on first read was dealt with yesterday in closed session. The board did approve the request from an educator for an additional year to complete requirements for lateral entry license. We had ESMP 2 coming under discussion. We have changes in the test codes from 7803 to 1713, and this is the praxis content knowledge for teaching mathematics, and that is required of elementary education majors, and ECGC, exceptional children, general curriculum for the math subtest requirements. The other item under discussion in a related way was the praxis test reading, K-12 test code change, and also a cut score change from 159 to 156, and that was a vendor-generated change. And we had two consent items. We have the Central Carolina Alternative Teacher Preparation Program is requesting to transfer from a lateral entry provider to the residency model, and that is also now required in SB 599. The last consent item, in a nutshell, Western Governors University has received accreditation by CAPE, and they are requesting from the state board to become an EPP provider in North Carolina. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Dr. Oxendine. I'll now recognize Mr. Buxton, Chair of the Student Learning and Achievement Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm joined on this committee by Dr. Olivia Oxendine. We had 3 discussion items, SLA 1 related to our information and technology standards, and a request for board to adopt the International Society for Technology and Education Standards, known as ISTE, and that would be adoption of the standards to install this coming school year, 1920, and then to implement in 2021. We also had a presentation with Lieutenant Governor, Friday Institute, and our department on the Computer Science Standards Development, SLA 2. Again, when we come back, we will vote on amending our policies to allow computer science to be a North Carolina standard course of study, and then to move forward in developing the framework and implementation, and to develop the computer science standards by April of next year, and then we would be voting to approve those specific standards by April of next year. And finally, we had a good and necessarily lengthy discussion on SLA 3, policies governing services for children with disabilities on the autism spectrum disorder. I thought a lot of good clarifying questions and issues, a lot of, I think, still outstanding questions, and the department is committed to put this on the agenda of the June 12th EC Advisory Committee and come back to us with feedback from that council, which serves an advisory body to us, but also to continue to solicit input from parents and to have some more discussion with us about those conversations. That will not come back in July for action. That will come back in August for action. And then finally, we had a brief update on our reading diagnostic plans. More to come on that later. We have 2 consent items. SLA 4, which amends CCRE 001 on high school course for credit, dealing with continuing education pathways and potential high school course credit that can be awarded. And then SLA 5, 2 nominees, Lisa Estep, Chair of the New Hanover County Board of Education, and Kelly Price, CEO of Federal Programs in Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, to join our Committee of Practitioners Advisory Committee, which advises us on ESSA implementation. That's our report.
Thank you, Mr. Buxton. We're now going to take a 15-minute break. We'll be back in session at 12:40. We are back in session and welcome our Lieutenant Governor to our meeting and
Mr. Chair.
turn to him for a moment of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick moment of personal privilege. I'm honored to have one of my interns with me today, a young man named Matthew Schwab, who is in the audience. Matthew, why don't you stand up here? Matthew has Down syndrome. He went through public school in Holly Springs and through the special ed program, and he is a public speaker. He has multiple jobs, including working at Chick-fil-A, but he has his own company as well, where he goes around and does public speaking advocacy for Down syndrome and for Gigi's Playhouse, and such a very exceptional young man. So I'm honored to have Matthew here interning with me. So Matthew, welcome. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Governor Forrest. I'll now turn to Ms. Amy White, Chair of the Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools Committee.
Mr. Chair, I am Amy White. I am the Chair of the Education, Innovation, and Charter School Committee, and I share that responsibility with Ms. Jill Kamnitz. We had a great committee discussion yesterday. I'll point my colleagues to the consent item, which is EICS 8, which we will approve later today with the Winston-Salem Forsyth County's Restart application. For the discussion items for this month, we had 2 restart applications from Chatham County Schools and from Weldon City Schools. That was EICS 6 and EICS 7. We had a discussion regarding Queen City's, it's a STEM charter school, a request to increase their enrollment over 30%. That enrollment request comes because that school is going to be starting a high school. Their original projection was 559, and I believe they're going to be moving, when the high school starts, they'll be moving up into the 700s. That will be back before you next month for approval. And then another item of discussion was North Carolina Virtual Academy's request to increase enrollment by 20% by general statute. And so we had the opportunity to have dialogue about that particular school's request. We have 2 items on first read and an action item. And if it would please the board, what I'd like to do is just mention briefly one of the items on action on first read is Westlake Prep's Academy request to decrease its year 1 enrollment projections, and that's because of its inability to secure a permanent location, and they're going to be in a church facility for a year. So they're going to decrease their enrollment as a result of that. That'll be action on first read. Then when, Mr. Chair, when we actually take the vote later in the meeting, it will be important for us to vote on the charter school recommendations before we actually vote on the charter school grant recommendations, because we have several schools in those grant recommendations that are seeking approval this month, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, we're prepared to have the EICS 3 vote before EICS 1.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's look, just because we had quite a bit of discussion yesterday and we requested additional information from the Office of Charter Schools about a couple of the schools that were approved during this first grant process, I want to allow Mr. Dave Machado to come back to the podium to answer any questions regarding the information on EICS 1, the charter school program grant recommendations. Oh, and Mr. Whalen, thank you so much for being present today. Board members, any additional questions regarding the grant recommendations from staff? Sure. Mr. Duncan.
I don't know that I have questions. If you would allow me to make 2 or 3 comments, and I would appreciate your thoughts back, it'd be helpful. I do think that you've worked very hard on this, and I want to say I'm extremely appreciative of the level of work that's reflected in what you've done. It's a binder and a half of really thick notebooks amount of work, so it's a lot of work. So looking, and this is the first time you've put together a process, and I think you really worked hard at putting together a process, and what I can tell you, you had to start from scratch. You did not have some kind of rubric to work through. So I appreciate all that work a lot. the observations I'd like to make are threefold. One is, as we look at refining this process going forward, we might want to work off a 100-point scale instead of the 112-point scale it works out to be. And on that 12-point scale, which appear to be, I think the intent of that was to be objective criteria that would aid or further make the application attractive and reasons to want to provide assistance for that application. If we made that separate and made it more of a, whatever the scale is that we're looking to get to, you can be a little shorter, you can be a little over, but if you perform well on some of those other objective criteria, it can be something that provides input. Related to that, I think it'd be helpful if, the way it was described, that seemed to be, that was supposed to be more or less an objective, if somebody was within 15 miles of a school that was, there was no school within 15 miles of where this was suggested or not, and other such objective criteria. But when I looked at the scoring sheets, they were not scored consistently on that. There were some people that scored points and some schools that didn't score points for the same issue. So if there's a way to, maybe for the group to confer and have the same mindset at the end of it, instead of averaging scores, but rather have an important discussion just to get to the same place on that, I think would be helpful. And the last item I would say is, as I observed looking closely at the scoring sheets, there were in some instances where you had several instances perhaps where you had three that were relatively closely scored, and then you had one score was pretty aberrational in one way or the other, and what we would call several standard deviations different than the other score, mostly high, but there was at least one that I can think of that was several standard deviations below the other scores and assessments. And maybe talk those ones through so it help us, because we tried to read all these things, and I think it was helpful to me to read it. I think I pointed out one where there's a question about whether they actually got the 80 points, and you were kind enough to send an email to explain that later, that through averages and perhaps other reasons that applied, it made sense to do it. So at the end of the day, I'm going to vote for all these because I think the grants are important, and I appreciate the work the staff did to get the grants in the first place. But I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I do think as great as the process is that y'all put together, I actually think there are a few things that I would ask you to think about and look at to maybe even improve it further. So thank you for giving me that moment to take up that much time, and I apologize for it.
Take all the time in the world. That is what this board's responsibility is. And Mr. Duncan, I want to tell you how much I appreciate the scrutiny and diligence in which you reviewed those applications, and for giving the staff an opportunity to provide information to this board so that we could make the decision that would be in the best interest of those students with regard to this grant. So, board members, any other questions about any of those grant recommendations for EICS 1? Mr. Machado, a comment?
Yeah, I will just say that we appreciate the feedback. We've had a lot of those discussions. We're working right now on a review of the request for application, the rubric, the timeline. We'll be bringing those things to the board later this summer for approval. So we've thought a lot about how that tool in itself informs the work of the external evaluators and how we can improve our training to norm around scoring and some of the concerns that you raised.
Thank you. Thank you for the work on it. It's obviously a lot of work.
And also about the extra credit. When we were writing the grant, we were first intentional of putting the extra credit in there so we could push our applicants even further into a lunch program, transportation, and a weighted lottery. So the points are well taken, but that was the thought behind it when the application was written.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for your availability today. So the final item for discussion today, before we take a vote, are the 12 schools that have been recommended by the Charter School Advisory Board for approval by the State Board of Education. Yesterday, we had a lengthy discussion about several of the schools and their relevant applications. We have several staff members, and we have the chair of the Charter School Advisory Board and the vice chair, both in the audience with us today. I believe Alex Quigley is here to come and make a couple of comments. Before he gets to the podium, I want to reiterate to the folks listening that we received a copious amount of information about several of the applications. I know my board members, and I know that they read each of those emails or those pieces of communication thoroughly. We also had some communication from a local school system. What the comment that I would like to make is that we have a tremendous asset in the Charter School Advisory Board. And every year, this board approves the application procedure and the timeline for which charter applicants can submit the necessary paperwork. And all of the communication that we received after the Charter School Advisory Board made its recommendation really should have been sent directly to the Charter School Advisory Board so that they could also review that material. Because of that, I had the chance to review policy CHTR 019. And in that policy, there is a provision that allows for charter school applications that received a majority vote to approve by the CSAB if there is the possibility that there's a denial, that the State Board of Education will return the application to the Charter School Advisory Board for further review before denial on second reading. Again, that reference is CHTR 019, and that's the reason that I made the comment yesterday about sending one of the schools back for review by the Charter School Advisory Board, hearing comments from my colleagues. I've got Alex Quigley here today. I'm going to invite him to the podium to sort of make some comments about the process overall, and then we'll talk about any other schools that you'd like to discuss today.
Thank you, Ms. White, and thank you, board members. Thank you for having me here today. Apologize for not being able to be here yesterday. I was at King's Dominion with 200 third through eighth graders who had earned their end of year trip. I'll point out that we actually had a woman come up to us at lunch and say she was a school counselor, she worked in a different school district in Virginia, and basically just effusively praising, said, I've never seen kids so well behaved, your children are so polite and mature, I've been watching them throughout the park all day. So I just wanted to shout out the scholars from Healthy Start Academy and use my opportunity at the podium for that. That's as pertains to the Charter School Advisory Board process. I think Ms. White covered the key points that I wanted to underscore. I also just think that it's important that we have integrity, but in the decisions that we make and the recommendations we send to you, and not. I think I want to try to avoid stacking on additional processes or additional stipulations to a system that we feel like works. And one is, so I know there may have been some requests for to approve a charter with a stipulation. I think it would be better for us to not do that, frankly. If we're going to approve it, to just approve it. And we have mechanisms through the Ready to Open process to ensure that schools are meeting the components that they say that they're going to meet. So, for example, if a school were to say, and this did happen actually with a school that was approved through the fast track process, we recommended in the interview process that they do a weighted lottery. We felt like, given that county situation, the location of this county, that it would make a lot of sense for that school to have a weighted lottery. And in general, we're recommending pretty much to every school that they have a weighted lottery. I would say almost across the board. They gained approval from you all. They went ahead and voted on a weighted lottery after that had approval. And at this point, through the Ready to Open process, we'll make sure that they do that. So there are schools make adjustments throughout the Ready to Open process. We don't want schools to change their charter or change their mission or focus, but if a school needs to adjust the number of students that are going to attend that school in the ready to open process, that is something that happens quite frequently, because the reality when the rubber meets the road of recruiting students can be very, very difficult. I know that's kind of something that's on your minds with one of the schools that we're talking about today. I also think that per the policy, if you have a charter before you that it looks like you're not going to approve, I do think our board will take into consideration any additional kind of information or recommendations that applicant has made. But we did send the school forward with the recommendation based on the application that they had, and felt confident in that application as a board. So I wanted to touch on that, and I think it's very important that we don't, frankly, to Ms. White's point, allow outside information or change it, or basically creating two application processes, one that happens with the Charter School Advisory Board, and then a whole nother one that happens, we got this feedback for the interview, now we're gonna revise it all these different ways, and maybe that will make the state board be happy about it. I think we want to try to avoid that, and try to keep the process as clear and clean as possible. And I'm happy to answer any other questions that you may have.
Without addressing a particular school, does any board member have a question for Mr. Quigley regarding process or procedure? Okay, great. What board members, I'm just gauging our discussion from yesterday. We called each particular of the 12 schools. We called each particular school, and I asked you if you had independent feedback or questions about those schools. There were 3 schools that we had questions about at the table. They were Robert J. Brown, North Raleigh Charter Academy, and Wake Prep Academy. Do you have any further questions on those 3 schools today?
I could ask one, if you don't mind, on Robert J. Brown. How did the CSAB board take into account the capacity issues? That is, the areas, the schools surrounding the capacity issues. Maybe that's a process question, but it's directed to something specific. And I need to add, the capacity numbers that we were given are inflated to be completely fair.
If I can speak for CSAB.
Please.
I think with that particular application, there was an awful lot of talk about the capacity of that board and its desire for wraparound services. The school is a vacant school in a neighborhood of high poverty, economic disadvantage. They purposely wanted to be in there, and the processes and the procedures that they explained to CSAB explained how they were going to do training for parents. They were going to do laundry at their school. Everything that you hear about wraparound services, they were prepared to do. And several people that were either going to be on the board or work at the school at some point had done that at charter schools in Washington, D.C. So I know our office, and I believe CSAB, if I can speak for them, was very comfortable with their plans and their proposals.
Ms. White, if I can just make a comment related to this, and this is really in line with what Mr. Quigley was saying, and I think now, Mr. Keenan, you and I are the old guys on the board here. Now, the board has changed so much. We've watched this process change so much over the last 7 years, going through different charter school advisory boards and their processes, and them updating their processes and getting more and more serious about their processes. And we saw in the early days a lot of charter schools that were getting approved and then having to be shut down. And we don't see that anymore because of the seriousness of the process that these folks go through. I know that my general counsel sits on the Charter School Advisory Board on my behalf, and spends hundreds of hours, just hundreds of hours every time this process comes up. I know everybody else on that board does as well. And so while this is not a new process, but this is a continually growing and advancing process. It's getting better and better and better every single year because of the impact and the feedback that this board has had on that. I mean, I do trust this process immensely. because of the amount of work and just the thousands of hours that goes into the documentation. Mr. Duncan, as you see on your desk, these giant books that you carry around with you. I mean, this is really pretty amazing, and I'm thankful for the work they do, Mr. Quigley and your whole group there. But I just want to assure everybody that this is taken very seriously. There's nobody that's not carrying their weight going through this process.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Appreciate those comments. Okay.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Do we have a board, does the statute require that we have a voting state board member on CSAB?
Not at this time, Dr. Oxana. Years ago it was, and General Assembly changed that statute, so you do appoint 2 members. Mr. Quigley and Ms. Turner are the 2 that you appoint, but somebody from this body does not sit on the CSAB like it did several years ago.
I just want to ditto the Lieutenant Governor's statements and his assessment of CSAB. It's just incredible the work that they do and the amount of time that they give it, and I have complete confidence in the CSAB process.
So, given the discussion at the board table yesterday, there were considerable amount of questions regarding Wake Prep Academy and North Raleigh Charter Academy. And given the process and the procedure and the desire from particularly our committee standpoint to protect that procedure that's already in place, what I'd like to recommend is that we send North Raleigh Charter Academy and Wake Prep Academy back to CSAB. They will be meeting on Monday of this week and not vote on them today, simply because we have had an inordinate amount of communication from a variety of different entities, and the place and the time for that really is the CSAB vetting process and not this process. Mr. Chair, it's your pleasure.
Yeah, so the way we can handle that is we'll have one vote on all the EICS 3 schools except those 2, and then you make that motion on those 2, and we'll then be able to gauge the board's desire.
I think that sounds like a great process. Thank you for that. I also want to remind my colleagues that when it does take the opportunity to vote, that I will be recusing myself on Doral Academy of North Carolina.
And Mrs. White, just a question for clarification. When we make these decisions at the board level, are the folks that are associated with those charter schools, are they clear about why we're making those? I mean, you were saying there's been a lot of conversation or whatever. I'm not clear as to exactly why we're pulling those out right now. I heard the conversation yesterday. I know you had more conversation in your committee related to this as well, but could you just briefly maybe what the kind of offenses were that people were worried about?
Sure. For several of the schools in Wake County, we had communication directly from the State Board of Education, received communication from the Wake County Public School System, which could be considered an impact statement. The time to receive that impact statement should have been during the CSAB review process and not during this process. Nevertheless, we did receive that. The policy that we have in place with regard to new information allows us the opportunity to send that back to CSAB, but the message that Ms. Kamnitz and our committee would like to re-emphasize to those that want to weigh in on situations like that is that, in particular, recommendations from school systems, that the time for them to make their concerns or accolades known would be during the process for which the Charter School Advisory Board is making their review. Additionally, we had one particular school that wanted to suggest that we would make stipulations, and in conversations with the Charter School Advisory Board, it was made clear to us that if they can make changes during the ready to open process, that schools can make changes to their enrollment numbers and their perhaps a weighted lottery during that process, as opposed to once it's come to us in order to encourage us to vote one way or another. Does that help clarify?
Thank you. If I just may just make one more comment related to that, I don't think it's a question, but I do tend to agree with you that I think that, what you tend to see is what appear to be almost like stall tactics from people, that we know this process is going on. It's not a secretive or hidden process. We want to make sure everybody's voice is heard, make sure they're heard clearly and everybody has a voice in this, but we do have a process for a reason. So I feel like in ways we're punishing these applicants, though they've been approved. Now we're punishing them because other people aren't, going through the proper procedures and process that they have to go through and that we're requiring of them to do. So I just want to make sure that, the charter community and everybody else that's engaged in this feels like they're being treated fairly through this process as well by us, the board, and that we're not just being reactionary. So, to whatever degree we can be clear with those folks that are wanting to make their voice heard in the process as to the timing of that, so we don't end up doing this every time this process comes up, right? Because we tend to do these kind of things. Yeah, I've been doing this for 7 years, and we do it every time. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. You said it much more eloquently than I.
I don't know if I did, but
It's more
just trying to
about
make my point.
process and procedure than it
Yeah.
is about an actual call to a vote today.
And then one point of clarification, if I may. So sorry to delay this. But related to that, if that goes back to the CSAB and they go through the process of whatever additional information, does that come back for a vote then to the board? If CSAB approves those schools again, they come back when? Is that next month or?
I think the policy says by August.
It has to be by August.
And one final point, and I apologize. How does that impact the charter school's ability to get started on time for the school year that they want to begin operation?
I'm going to defer to Mr. Machado and Mr. Quigley.
These schools are on the traditional ready-to-open timeline, so they have a whole year ramp-up period, so it's just...
Nothing's fast-tracked in this. They should be fine.
No, not in, these are regular applicants.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Quigley. Thank you.
So just to recap, we'll compartmentalize those schools that, for one single vote, and then the two that have been recommended, or we'll separate those out, and Mr. Davis will handle that. At the time that we need to make the vote.
And, Ms. Chair, just since Ms. White mentioned it, I would also remind that there are two applicants that are considering dual language immersion programs, and while I'm not aware that a group of which I have a consulting relationship which does dual language, I'm not aware they're gonna be working together. Out of an abundance of caution, I'm gonna recuse myself from that. Those two, CE Academy and MENA Charter School.
Yeah, I'll mention both of your recusals prior to the vote, just to make sure we're clear.
Thank you very much. Board members, any other discussion or this is your time to ask questions. Any other discussion today about any of these schools before us for approval? Hearing none, Mr. Chair, that concludes our committee report.
Thank you, Ms. White. I'll now recognize Mr. Ford, Chair of the Strategic Planning Committee.
Thank you, I was going to say thank you, Mr. Ford. Mr. Davis, I'm Mr. Ford. Looking forward to getting done with this meeting. I am James Ford, chairing the Strategic Planning Committee along with my counterpart, Ms. Jill Kamitz. And yesterday, as part of our issue session, we brought in and were able to hear from Dr. Rodney Trice from the Office of Equity Affairs from Wake County Public Schools, where we had a wonderful presentation that really exemplified some of the outstanding work that's being done on the district level. It was very informative for the purposes of us trying to understand how our core values of whole child and equity could permeate not just at the state level, but at the local education agencies. He spent quite a bit of time, along with his staff, outlining their function, organizational structure, and philosophy. They talked about family engagement, coaching and leadership, student engagement, teacher support, minority and women-owned businesses, as well as state and federal compliance. Some of the suggestions that were offered when questioned about what we could do as a state board to help assist local education agencies, Dr. Trice raised the notion of convening, that he has peers, other folks in districts who are doing equity work either full-time or as part of another position, but they often don't have the opportunity to connect and build capital with each other. In addition to that, we entertained the notion as raised by Vice Chair Duncan of potentially engaging in a statewide disparity study germane to the minority and women-owned businesses. After that, we transitioned to an update of our strategic plan, where we are in that process. As it currently stands, everything is on schedule. We just are coming on the heels of community outreach, where we've reached out and have heard from shareholders in every region of our state, 260 plus responses, all of which were diverse but overwhelmingly in the positive direction, approving of the general ideologies that we're embracing with this plan. There was the notion and some discussion of needing further clarity on the intersections of whole child and equity, making sure that that the language is massaged in a way where it's accessible to the average stakeholder, but then it's sensical. It makes sense where these things are not separated, but they're clearly braided. We even talked about some of the mental models and even the visual, perhaps maybe needing to be tweaked in order for it to be a little more understandable to the layperson. And so that's one of the things we're going to end up highlighting. And actually, if we could take a moment, Dr. Petrie Martin, if you want to just elaborate a little bit on the way those two concepts do intersect and the way that they are cohesive in our approach.
So good afternoon to everyone. And I was asked just to take us back to the fall of 2017, which we first started the equity discussions with the board. And it was at that time that we brought to you a document called Leading for Equity, which came from the Council of Chief State Schools Officers. And within there was a definition of equity. And it read that it means that every student has access to the resources and educational rigor they need at the right moment in their education, despite race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, family background, or family income. So with that being said, the whole child model could clearly be one of the approaches or tools that you're using to get to this approach. So I was asked to come up and just reiterate that is where we started back in the fall of 2017. And if we're continuing this journey, that certainly would support the definition, which appears to be the goal. So.
Thank you, Dr. Petrie Martin. Mr. McKinney also took a stab at passing me a note initially, but then submitting for the record a cohesive statement that would accompany our approach so as to explain very concisely what it is we're attempting to do. His thoughts were appreciated, and also Mr. Chair elaborated as well that our work is ultimately about taking care of every part of the student for every student, and that's a slight paraphrase. And so as we continue this engagement process, we're on schedule to potentially approve. We have to dig further into some of the feedback we've received, revise some of those things, again, massage the language. Our hope is to come at the next month's meeting with a robust plan with explanations for all of the factors involved, and hopefully we'll be primed for approval so long as we can include those metrics as well as feasibility components to go along with that. So if there are no questions, Mr. Chair, that concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. I now recognize Mr. Duncan for the Business Operations Committee report.
Thank you. Along with Todd Chastain, we lead the Business Operations Committee. We had 2 items for action on first reading. One was the pre-approval of Financial and Business Services Policy Manual, which is an annual effort after the legislature has put forward enough information to revise the manual, and Alexis Schaus led us in that discussion. BizOp 2 was the NC State Improvement Project, which is for new sites to be opened and continuing with the sites that are already open. Sherry Thomas and Dr. Paula Crawford presented on that, and we're excited about what that grant will allow us to continue to do in that area. BizOp 3, which is an action item coming back after discussion earlier, something we've been working on for a long time and we're all very excited about, which is the SBE policy amendment, which is part of the process of putting in place the contract for the school business system modernization, LEA, enterprise resource planning, which is a long way of saying the new system that's going to help make schools work a whole lot more smoothly. And we thank Phil Emer for his presentation on that and for his continued work from the Friday Institute, along with our own staff who's done such an excellent job on this. We had a discussion item which we agreed by consensus to raise to an action on first reading item, which is an SBE policy amendment on early grade reading proficiency, which we discussed and intend to put in place. We had an update on contracts, both executed and planned. We had a requested update that the board asked for an agency vacancy report, which we thank Melissa Warner for giving to us and her duties in HR. And I think at the end of that report, we asked for that report to start coming on a monthly basis. Ms. Warner promised there'd be a little bit, could be some more granular detail that the board asked for, which included how many temporaries we're filling into positions and that type of information, so we can get a very clear scope on where what our status was, and to the extent there were any efforts to redirect, for example, positions where they could be more usefully helpful to the students in North Carolina, that process would also be made known. And finally, we have a consent agenda item, which was the certification of NCLEA finance officer, one of our continuing friends, and we have one to approve on that consent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Board members, we will now vote on any item requiring action from your committee reports, beginning with the consent agenda. A thorough discussion and report was provided on each item, including any respective consent items. Remember that any item on the consent agenda is primarily not complex and may have come to the board for discussion in the prior month. I note also that board members have seen these consent agenda items for at least a week. So at this time, I ask if there's a request to remove any item from the consent agenda, and if not, I ask for a motion to approve HRS 1, ESNP 3 and 4, SLA 4 and 5, and EICS 8 on the consent agenda. Motion by Ms. Kamitz. Is there a second?
I second.
Second by Dr. Oxendine. Any discussion? Seeing none, Dr. Townsend Smith, will you capture the vote?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Kamnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yes.
Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chastain?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Treasurer Falwell?
Yes.
Lieutenant Governor?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes.
It's unanimous.
The motion carries. Thank you. We'll now move to a motion to approve the following meeting minutes together with the action and action on first reading items as follows. First, April 30th through May 1st, 2019, and May 13th and 23rd, 2019 conference call meeting minutes, and the executive committee May 16 and 30, 2019 meeting minutes. And I note for the record that Mr. Chastain recuses himself from this portion of the vote. This motion also includes SBOP-006 policy update that Dr. Townsend Smith presented this morning. This motion includes ESNP 1 action on first reading, BizOp 1 and 2 and 4 action on first reading, and BizOp 3 action item, and EICS 2 action on first reading item. Is there a motion to this effect?
So moved.
Motion by Dr. Oxendine, a second. Second by Mr. Keenan. Any questions, discussion, clarification needed on these items? Seeing none, Dr. Townsend Smith?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Kamnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yes.
Mr. Chastain?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Treasurer Falwell?
Yes.
Lieutenant Governor?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes. Motion carries. We'll now move to our two final action items.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Ms.
I did not have the opportunity to vote.
I definitely want to give you that
I want my
opportunity.
right to vote.
Right, that's right.
Yes.
Yes, Ms. White, I am so sorry.
Well, that just put the motion over the hurdle.
My apologies.
Thanks for
Ms.
keeping
White.
us straight, Ms. White.
Mr. Chair, I
Suffrage.
just noticed, when you did the consent agenda, I'm not sure Biz Op 5 was on that list. I just want to make sure it gets approved.
It was not, so we'll have a separate vote for that.
I'm sorry, did
No
not
problem.
notice
Thanks
that
for
earlier.
catching that. Not 5. Okay, so let's do that first, before we go to these last two action items. So, motion to approve Biz Op 5 on the consent agenda.
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Duncan, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Chastain, any questions? Dr. Townsend Smith?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yes.
Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chastain?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Treasurer Falwell? Lieutenant Governor?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes. Okay, motion carries. The next item will deal with EICS 3, charter schools recommended for approval to open in 2020. And this motion will be to approve the Charter School Advisory Board recommendation for 10 schools on their list excluding North Raleigh Charter Academy and Wake Prep Academy. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Motion by Ms. White, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Ford. Any questions on this motion?
Oh, Mr. Chair. Procedural question. Can I make the
Yes, sir.
motion if I've recused myself on one of the items in question?
Mr. Snyder?
I remove
Yeah.
I remove my motion.
Well, hang on.
The cleanest way to do this, and unfortunately would be a bit more time consuming, would be to take multiple votes and actually
Split it apart.
split out the recusals.
There you go.
However, we could also note for the minutes, the recusals that Mr. Buxton and Ms. White have made and proceed, just noting those for the minutes, and if there was any controversy with respect to it, we could do a separate vote.
Any issue with Ms. White making the motion, considering that she is recusing herself from the Doral Academy item?
Ms. White, perhaps the easiest thing would be for you to rescind the motion and allow someone else to make it.
Rescind the motion.
Okay, all right, we'll start over. EICS 3, charter school recommended for approval to open in 2020. The motion is to approve 10 of the charter schools recommended from the CSAB report, with the exception of North Raleigh Charter Academy and Wake Prep Academy. And I note for the record that Ms. White recuses herself from the Doral Academy and Mr. Buxton recuses himself from the MENA Charter and CE Academy vote. Is there a motion?
So move.
Motion by Mr. Ford. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Chastain. Any questions on this vote? Dr. Townsend Smith?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yes.
Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chastain?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Treasurer Falwell? Lieutenant Governor?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes. Motion carries. The next item will deal with EICS 3 and specifically North Raleigh Charter Academy and Wake Prep Academy. And I'll turn to Ms. White for this motion.
Mr. Chair, in accordance with CHTR 019, I would like to request that the State Board of Education send North Raleigh Charter Academy and Wake Prep Academy back to the Charter School Advisory Board for further review and recommendation.
Motion by Ms. White. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Dr. Oxendine. Any questions on this motion? Seeing none, Dr. Townsend Smith?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yes.
Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chastain?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Treasurer Falwell? Lieutenant Governor?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes. Motion carries. Our last action item for the day concerns EICS 1, and I note for the record that Mr. Buxton has recused himself from the MENA Charter Academy and CE Academy item on this motion, on this item. So is there a motion to approve the EICS 1 action on first reading item, Charter Schools Program grant recommendations.
So moved.
Motion by Ms. White, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Lieutenant Governor Forrest. Any discussion on this item? Hearing none, Dr. Townsend Smith.
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan? Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chasteen?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Treasurer Falwell? Lieutenant Governor?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes. Motion carries. Board members, this concludes our committee meetings for the day and some really good work over the last 2 days. I want to thank all members of our staff, each member of the board, and all the stakeholders who participated in this meeting. Seeing that we have no other new business, I ask for a motion to adjourn the June 6th State Board of Education meeting.
So moved.
Motion by Lieutenant Governor Forrest, a second. Second by Mr. Chasteen. Dr. Townsend Smith.
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yeah.
Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chasteen?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Lieutenant Governor?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes, we are adjourned.